My father always told me that family is a fortress, but he forgot to mention that sometimes the call is coming from inside the walls. The air inside Calvin Pierce's downtown Philadelphia law office tastes like refrigerated ozone and expensive leather. I sit perfectly still, watching a single bead of sweat trace a slow path down my father's temple. I pick up a red administrative pen, the exact one I used to strike out faulty indemnity clauses at the hospital, and slide it across the smooth mahogany expanse separating us. "Sign the deed to the cabin, Hector," I say, keeping my voice stripped of any warmth. "Or I call the district attorney." He stares at the plastic barrel of the pen as if it were a loaded weapon. Let me rewind. 72 hours earlier, the fortress fell. It was a Tuesday morning in the Lehigh Valley, my 33rd birthday. Outside my townhouse windows, the Pennsylvania autumn had turned the trees into brilliant streaks of rust and gold, a sharp contrast to the gray industrial bones of the old steel mills on the horizon. Usually, birthdays in the Mendoza household involve a barrage of group texts by 7 in the morning. Carmen, my mother, favors excessive emojis. Leo, my younger brother, sends a generic meme. Hector calls on his way to his manufacturing plant. This year, the screen of my phone remained a dark, blank mirror. I poured my coffee, assuming they were just running late. Then the notification pinged. It was an email from Hector's business account, drafted with the sterile precision of a corporate termination notice. Diana, given your recent refusal to support the family in a time of crisis, your mother and I have made a difficult decision. We are severing ties. You are financially and emotionally cut off. Do not contact us. I read the text twice. The words felt hollow. A puzzle missing its centerpieces. Support the family. Nobody had asked me for anything. I negotiate vendor contracts for elite healthcare networks. I earn my own living. I haven't relied on them for a dime since college. A strange, cold instinct urged me to open my laptop. I logged into my primary banking portal, bypassing my checking and savings, to click on the separate tab for my grandmother's trust. My grandmother was a pragmatic woman who understood the unforgiving nature of the world. She left me an inheritance of $450,000 locked behind a specific legal stipulation. The fund was co-managed by Hector, serving as the trustee, and the money could only be dispersed when I was ready to purchase a home within state lines. Because my career demanded grueling hours and constant mobility between regional hospitals, I chose to rent a modern apartment. The trust sat in legal limbo, gathering interest, waiting for me to settle down. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. Available balance: $0.00. The coffee in my mug stopped steaming. The ambient hum of my refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. I refreshed the browser. I cleared the cache. I logged out and logged back in. The zeros remained. Hector exploited the exact loophole my grandmother inadvertently created. By waiting for me to focus on my career, he found a window to drain the vault. Before I tell you what I did to get every single penny back, welcome to Jessica Told Stories. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment telling me your age, and if you have ever been ghosted by your own blood. Tell me what it felt like when the silence finally made sense. Sitting at my kitchen island, the reality of the situation locked into place like a deadbolt. My parents didn't just cut me off. They robbed me, and the email was nothing but a preemptive smokescreen to justify the theft. To understand how a father rationalizes emptying his own daughter's future, you have to understand the ecosystem of our family. I spend my days navigating the sterile, high-stakes environment of Pennsylvania Healthcare Administration. My job is catching discrepancies. I sit in air-conditioned conference rooms under buzzing fluorescent lights, staring down pharmaceutical representatives and surgical supply vendors, searching for hidden markups and breached contracts. I am trained to look at a ledger, filter out the pleasantries, and spot the lie. It requires a cold eye and a steady pulse. I built my life on being reliable, self-sufficient, and invisible. My younger brother Leo is the exact opposite. He is the undisputed golden boy, a title he earned simply by existing. Leo possesses the kind of smile that makes people forget he owes them money. He coasted through a prestigious university on my parents' dime, earning a vague business degree, and has spent the last decade launching a series of phantom startups. There was the craft brewery that never secured a lease, the logistics app that never hired a coder. Every failure was quietly swept under the rug, cushioned by Hector's checkbook and Carmen's endless reserve of excuses. Leo never had to negotiate for a single breath of air. He was the main event, and I was the stage crew keeping the lights on. I was still sitting at my kitchen island, staring at the zero balance on my screen, when my phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The sudden noise made my heart jump into my throat. I picked it up, expecting a delayed birthday wish or a panicked explanation from my mother. Instead, the screen displayed a text from my Aunt Lucia. "You are a greedy daughter. How could you abandon your parents in their darkest hour? Your mother is weeping. You should be ashamed to show your face in this town." I read the words again. The syllables felt sharp, jagged. A cold numbness started at the base of my neck and spread downward. Lucia is my mother's oldest sister, a woman who treats neighborhood gossip as a competitive sport. She would never send a message like that unless she had been explicitly fed a narrative. The gears in my mind clicked into place, interlocking with chilling precision. Hector and Carmen did not just drain the trust fund. They needed a smokescreen. They live in a conservative, appearance-obsessed suburban community where social standing is oxygen. If Hector suddenly stopped paying the country club dues, or if Carmen stopped hosting her lavish charity luncheons, people would talk. They needed a justifiable reason for their sudden lack of liquidity. So they sacrificed me. They were spinning a tragic tale to the extended family and their affluent neighbors. The story was predictable, but effective. They claimed I had ruthlessly demanded my trust fund early, legally cornering my father and taking the money to fund my own selfish lifestyle, leaving them financially crippled. It painted them as heartbroken, generous parents betrayed by a ruthless corporate daughter. But that lie only explained where the money went. It did not explain why they needed to steal it in the first place. Lucia sent a second text, answering my unspoken question. Leo is terrified. He made a mistake, but family protects family. You left him to the wolves. The wolves. I set the phone down. The screen went dark, but the implication hovered in the air. I knew exactly what narrative Leo had planted. For weeks, he had been acting erratic, dodging phone calls and missing Sunday dinners. He told the extended family he had partnered with the wrong investors for a new commercial real estate venture. He claimed these were dangerous people, bad actors with deep ties to organized crime. He heavily implied physical threats, painting himself as a tragic entrepreneur mixed up with loan sharks. It was a classic cinematic red herring. The mob trope played perfectly into Hector's desperate need for dramatic victimhood. It made my father look like a heroic patriarch, draining his own resources to save his son from broken kneecaps. My jaw tightened until my teeth ached. The character assassination was brilliant in its cruelty. It isolated me, ensuring that if I tried to complain about the missing money, the rest of the family would view me as a monster, complaining about cash while her brother's life was on the line. I felt the familiar hot prickle of tears threatening the corners of my eyes. A biological response to profound betrayal. But I forced myself to swallow it down. Crying is sloppy. Anger is unpredictable. Right now, I needed to be the administrator. I needed to be the woman who dismantles million-dollar discrepancies before lunch. I opened a new browser tab. The banking portal was still logged in. My grandmother's trust was a sophisticated financial instrument, meaning any movement of funds left a deep, indelible digital footprint. You cannot move nearly $500,000 without generating routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and SWIFT codes. I requested the transaction history for the past 90 days. The screen loaded, populating a spreadsheet of outgoing transfers. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the dense rows of alphanumeric data. Hector had not taken the money out in one lump sum. He had bled the account dry over the course of 4 weeks, authorizing rapid, staggering transfers. $50,000 on a Tuesday, $80,000 on the Thursday. I copied the receiving routing numbers and pasted them into a global financial registry database I use for international hospital vendors. I expected to find a shell company in Delaware, or perhaps a holding firm in the Cayman Islands, something that aligned with Leo's story of dangerous investors and shadowy real estate deals. The search query finished. The results populated on the screen. I stared at the designated endpoint, feeling a dark, hollow laugh building in my chest. The money was not routed to the mob. It did not go to dangerous loan sharks or shady venture capitalists. The transfers were sent to a generic offshore payment processor headquartered in Antigua. It was a clearinghouse used almost exclusively for a mundane, highly publicized online sportsbook. There were no wolves. There was no physical danger. The Golden Boy had simply gambled away my inheritance from the comfort of his smartphone. I pictured Leo sitting on my parents' velvet sofa, placing reckless parlays and proposition bets on college football games, losing tens of thousands of dollars with a casual swipe of his thumb. When the deficit grew too large, when the VIP account manager demanded payment, he panicked. He ran to Hector, cried about dangerous men, and Hector chose to rip apart my future to cover Leo's pathetic lack of discipline. The reality was so pathetic, so remarkably ordinary it took my breath away. They destroyed our family not over a matter of life and death, but over sports betting. I closed the laptop. The urge to pick up my phone, call my father, and scream until my vocal cords shredded flared up like a sudden fever. I wanted to hurl Aunt Lucia's text back in her face. I wanted to shatter their pristine suburban illusion, but reacting emotionally would give them the upper hand. If I called screaming, they would record it. They would play it for the neighbors. They would use my rage as proof that I was the unstable, greedy daughter they claimed I was. They expected a tantrum. They expected me to fight a war of feelings. I stood up from the kitchen island, the cold granite smooth beneath my fingertips. I was not going to fight with feelings. I was going to fight with paper. I walked into my home office, unlocked my filing cabinet, and pulled out a fresh, unmarked manila folder. I picked up my favorite red pen. I was going to build an architecture of evidence so flawless, so legally binding, that their fortress of lies would collapse on top of them. The truth about theft is that the missing money is rarely the part that breaks you. The true damage is found in the mechanics of the crime. It is the chilling realization of how much effort, planning, and deliberate deception was required to betray you. I sat in the unnatural quiet of my home office, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across my desk. I needed to understand the execution of the fraud. I booted up my personal hard drive, navigating past spreadsheets of hospital vendor margins to locate a specific encrypted folder. I opened a scanned PDF of my grandmother's original trust documents. The file was 50 pages long, drafted a decade ago by a meticulous estate attorney who understood the frailties of human nature. I scrolled down to Article 4, the section governing early disbursements. My eyes traced the dense legal text. The bylaws were unambiguous. Any withdrawal made before a qualifying real estate purchase required dual authorization, 2 signatures, Hector's and mine. Modern financial institutions operate as fortresses of compliance. You do not simply wire hundreds of thousands of dollars to an offshore sports betting clearinghouse on a whim. The Patriot Act anti-money laundering regulations and internal audit triggers demand friction. Moving that kind of capital requires a notary, dual identification, and strict in-person verification. Hector could not have transferred the balance using a smartphone app from his living room sofa. He had to bypass the fortress. I picked up my phone and dialed the customer service number for the regional bank branch located in the affluent suburb where my parents live. I did not use the panicked, trembling tone of a robbed daughter. I used my hospital administrator voice. It is the precise, flat tone I reserve for pharmaceutical representatives who attempt to sneak unauthorized surcharges into quarterly invoices. It leaves no room for debate. A junior relationship manager answered the call. He sounded young, eager to please a high net worth account holder. I verified my identity using my social security number and my mother's maiden name. A bitter irony, considering Carmen was currently orchestrating my social ruin across her country club network. I instructed the young man to pull the authorization records for the recent sequence of wire transfers. The keyboard clacked through the receiver. The relationship manager hesitated, his customer service cheerfulness faltering. He informed me that he could not view the standard teller queue for those specific transactions. They were not processed at the front desk. The wire transfers were authorized and executed directly from the private terminal of the branch manager, Arthur Gable. Arthur Gable. The name dropped like a lead weight to my stomach. I closed my eyes, and the image of the man materialized instantly. Ruddy cheeks, tailored suits that strained around the middle, a booming theatrical laugh. Arthur and my father have been fixtures at the local country club for over 20 years. I spent my childhood watching them drink aged scotch in the men's grill, swapping golf tips and complaining about property taxes. Arthur is scheduled to retire at the end of this fiscal year. He is a remnant of an old-school banking culture, an operator who relies on handshakes, golf course favors, and mutual suburban loyalty rather than rigorous compliance software. The puzzle pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Hector did not just panic one night. He put on a suit. He drove his pristine luxury sedan to the bank. He walked past the tellers and sat in Arthur Gable's glass-walled office. He probably complained about the financial burdens of his children, pouring a foundation of sympathy, and then he handed over the withdrawal slips. Arthur, trusting his country club friend and coasting toward a comfortable pension, approved the offshore wires without ever picking up a phone to verify my consent. He overrode the security protocols for a buddy. It was not a crime of passion. It was systemic, premeditated fraud. I instructed the nervous relationship manager to email me the scanned copies of the withdrawal slips immediately. I waited, watching the digital clock on my screen tick forward. When the PDF arrived in my inbox, I opened it. There, at the bottom of the digital page next to Hector's sprawling, confident signature, was mine. Or rather, Hector's interpretation of my name. I stared at the ink on the screen. The loop on the capital D was too wide. The cross on the T was rigid and forced. It lacked the fluid, hurried rhythm of my actual handwriting. A profound, icy sickness settled deep into my bones, a physical ache that radiated through my chest. My father sat at a mahogany desk, studied a sample of my handwriting, and practiced forging my name. He carefully traced the letters of my identity to steal my future. This was the moment the betrayal truly metastasized. It forced a brutal, humiliating internal reckoning. Every single day, I walk into a regional medical center and dissect ledgers worth tens of millions of dollars. I am known among my colleagues for catching a 0.2% billing error buried on page 40 of a surgical supply contract. I am relentless. I do not trust numbers until I verify them twice. Yet I left nearly $500,000 sitting in a local bank branch without ever setting up text alerts or dual-factor monitoring. I asked myself why I let this happen. Why did the most ruthless auditor in the Lehigh Valley leave her own vault unlocked? The answer tasted like ash. Because I wanted a family. In my professional life, I wear armor forged from skepticism and hard data. But everyone needs a sanctuary. I needed one corner of my existence where I could just be a daughter, where I could believe my father was a protector rather than a predator. I purposely left the trust unmonitored because auditing my own father felt like a betrayal of that fragile, hopeful illusion. I chose to be naive. I chose to lower my shield. My parents recognized that singular vulnerability. They saw the one place I was unarmed, and they aimed straight for the gap. The lingering sadness evaporated, burned away by a pure, crystalline focus. If I called Hector right now, if I confronted him with the forged slips over the phone, he would pivot. He would gaslight me with practiced ease. He would claim Arthur Gable made an administrative error, or he would swear I gave verbal consent during a Sunday dinner and simply forgot. Carmen would start weeping. She would tell Aunt Lucia and the rest of the extended family that I was trying to send my own father to federal prison over a banking misunderstanding. They thrive in the messy, subjective arena of family drama. They know how to manipulate emotions to confuse the facts. I could not fight them as a daughter. A daughter is bound by conditioned guilt, societal obligation, and the desperate lingering hope for an apology. I had to become the administrator. I moved my mouse and created a new encrypted folder on my desktop. I named it Hostile Liabilities. I dragged the trust bylaws, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged withdrawal slips into the digital vault. I made a conscious, deliberate decision to treat my parents as rogue corporate entities. There would be no emotional showdowns. There would be no screaming matches in their pristine suburban living room. There would only be leverage. I checked the clock on the wall. It was nearly noon. I had a grueling 12-hour shift waiting for me at the hospital. A quarterly budget review committee required my full, undivided attention. I snapped the laptop shut, walked into my bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. I pulled my tailored gray suit from the closet. The armor was going back on, and this time, it would not come off. I grabbed my car keys and headed out the door, focused entirely on the legal war I was preparing to wage. I was so consumed by the digital evidence, so focused on the paperwork, that I failed to anticipate the immediate physical danger. I did not know that while I was charting my strategy in the quiet of my townhouse, the Golden Boy was rapidly unraveling. I drove toward the medical center, entirely unaware that the pristine illusion of my brother had finally shattered, and he was waiting for me in the concrete shadows of the hospital parking structure. The air inside the multi-level concrete parking structure of Lehigh Valley Medical Center always carries a metallic chill, even in early autumn. I pushed through the heavy steel exit doors, letting the rhythmic echo of my low heels against the pavement ground me after a grueling 12-hour shift. The Hospital Budget Review Committee had been a marathon of spreadsheets, defensive department heads, and tense negotiations. I spent the day slicing through inflated equipment requests, matching invoices against delivery logs, operating with the clinical precision my career demands. My job is an exercise in finding the truth hidden in plain sight. But beneath that professional surface, My pulse carried a different, much heavier rhythm. The digital folder sitting on my home computer pulsed in my mind. The forged signatures, the offshore transfers, the betrayal. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting long, jaundiced pools of illumination across the gray concrete. My designated spot was on the 3rd level, a quiet, isolated corner reserved for senior administration. As I approached my sedan, my hand reached into my tailored blazer pocket, my fingers closing around my keys. A shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar beside my driver's side door. My breath caught a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline flooding my nervous system. I stopped walking, my grip tightening on my keys until the jagged metal bit into my palm. Diana. The voice was familiar yet strained, stripped of its usual easy confidence. Leo stepped into the yellow pool of light. The undisputed pride of the Mendoza household looked like a man who had not slept in a week. The pristine facade, carefully maintained through a lifetime of expensive haircuts, tailored clothing, and blind parental adoration, was visibly fracturing. His expensive dress shirt was wrinkled and unbuttoned at the collar. A shadow of dark stubble covered his jawline, and deep, bruised crescents hung beneath his eyes. His signature charismatic smile, the one that had charmed teachers, neighbors, and bankers for decades, was entirely gone. In its place was a tight, desperate grimace. He had no idea what I knew. In his mind, I was still the compliant, invisible sister, freshly cut off by our parents, reeling from the sudden excommunication. He thought I was vulnerable. "What are you doing here, Leo?" I said, keeping my voice flat, maintaining a measured distance. "I need to talk to you," he said, taking a step forward. The faint, sour scent of stale coffee and unwashed clothes drifted toward me, replacing the usual scent of his high-end cologne. "It has been a rough few days. The family is under a lot of pressure right now. You have been ignoring the situation. Mom and Dad are stressed," he continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were allies operating against a common enemy. "That business deal I told them about, the commercial real estate venture down in the city, it went sideways. The investors are playing hardball. Real hardball, Diana. I just need a little liquidity to bridge the gap. Just a temporary loan until the dust settles and the assets clear." He softened his posture, attempting to look like a tragic victim of circumstance. It was a masterful deployment of our mother's favorite manipulation tactic. Family helps family, Diana. You know that. I would not ask if it was not an emergency. We need to stick together. I looked at the man who had traded my future for parlays and proposition bets on an offshore sportsbook. I did not scream. I did not mention Arthur Gable or the forged withdrawal slip sitting in my encrypted file. I simply gave him the same answer I give to vendors who try to inflate their margins. No. The single syllable hung in the cold air. Leo blinked, his brow furrowing as if he had misheard me. "What do you mean, no?" "I am telling you I am in trouble. I need a lifeline. Just 30,000. You make that in a few months. You can spare it." "I am not giving you a single cent," I said, stepping around him toward my car door. "Go home, Leo." The rejection acted as a catalyst. The tragic victim routine evaporated instantly, replaced by something much darker and far more entitled. The mask slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered reality beneath the golden boy exterior. He lunged forward, slamming his hand flat against the window of my driver's side door, blocking my entry. "You do not get to walk away from me," he hissed, his voice echoing sharply off the concrete ceiling. The physical proximity was jarring. He leaned in his face, inches from mine, dropping the illusion of brotherhood entirely. The frantic energy radiating from him was palpable. Do you think you are untouchable, sitting up there in your corner office? He demanded. Mom and Dad already told the entire neighborhood you drained their savings dry. Aunt Lucia has been calling every cousin we have, warning them about your greed. Everyone knows what you did to us. I stared at his hand pressed against the glass, calculating the distance to the emergency call box on the far wall. If you do not write me a check by tomorrow morning, Leo snarled, his breath fogging the cold air between us, I will call the hospital board myself. I will schedule a meeting with the chief executive officer. I will tell them you embezzled from your own parents. I will tell them you are under active investigation for elder financial abuse. We have the community on our side. We have the narrative. By the time I am done talking, your pristine career will be ash. They will fire you before lunch, and you will never work in administration again. The threat was a calculated, precise strike, aimed at the very foundation of my identity. My career was my sanctuary. It was the only thing I possessed that Hector and Carmen could not claim credit for. I had built my reputation on unassailable ethics and meticulous financial oversight. Leo knew this. He was weaponizing the lie our parents had built to extort me. It was a staggering display of psychological warfare, proving that their deception was not merely a defensive cover-up. It was an active weapon in the hands of a desperate addict. A lesser version of myself, the version from a year ago, might have panicked. I might have tried to argue, to plead with him, to defend my reputation against the fabricated smear campaign. I might have tried to reason with a man who had already proven he had no reason left. Instead, I looked directly into his bloodshot, erratic eyes. I did not blink. I did not offer a single syllable of defense. I reached out, my movements slow and deliberate, and pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The car chirped. I pulled the handle, forcing him to step back to avoid the swinging metal door. I slid into the leather driver's seat and pulled the door shut with a solid, definitive thud. I pressed the central locking button. The heavy locks engaged with a synchronized click. Leo stood outside, his face twisted in disbelief. I started the engine. The headlights flared to life, washing him in a harsh, unforgiving glare. He threw a hand up to shield his eyes. I rolled down the window exactly 1 inch. You have no idea what you have done, I said quietly through the narrow gap. Before he could respond, the window rolled up, sealing the cabin. I shifted the transmission into drive. I did not speed away. I let my foot off the brake, allowing the sedan to glide forward at a measured, agonizingly slow pace. Leo slapped his hands against the trunk as I passed him. I will do it, Diana, he shouted, his voice muffled by the insulated glass. I will make the call. I drove down the circular ramp of the parking structure, leaving him standing alone in the gray expanse. In the rearview mirror, he looked small, a shrinking figure screaming into an empty garage. What would you do in that situation? Would you explode, shout your truth, and show your hand right there in the concrete darkness? Or would you stay silent, absorb the threat, and plot your countermeasure? Tell me in the comments. My silence terrified my brother far more than any screaming match ever could. By refusing to engage, I stripped him of his power to manipulate the narrative. His threat to ruin my career did not intimidate me. It clarified my purpose. It proved that my parents' lie was an active, ongoing threat. They were not going to stop. The extortion would continue until I surrendered everything I had built. I merged onto the interstate, the rhythmic hum of the tires stabilizing my racing pulse. I reached over to the passenger seat, picked up my phone, and bypassed my contacts list. I navigated to a secure note app where I kept a very specific set of numbers. The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for deployment had arrived. I tapped the screen, dialing a number I had kept filed away for extreme emergencies. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end, ready to help me set the trap. The drive down the Schuylkill Expressway into downtown Philadelphia offered plenty of time to rethink my strategy. The morning sky hung low and gray, matching the cold steel of the city skyline rising in the distance. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my mind replaying the encounter in the hospital parking garage. Leo had shown me the truth of our situation. There was no misunderstanding to clear up. There was no peace to broker. My family viewed me as a resource to be harvested, and when I refused to be drained, they decided to burn my reputation to the ground. I navigated the narrow city streets and pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass high-rise. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent and swift. When the doors parted, I stepped into the reception area of Pierce and Associates. The aesthetic of the law firm was designed to intimidate. Everything was constructed from dark mahogany, brushed steel, and frosted glass. The air smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee. I bypassed the plush waiting room chairs and approached the receptionist stating my name. Within moments, a set of heavy wooden double doors swung open. Calvin Pierce stood in the doorway. He was a man in his late 50s, possessing the lean, predatory build of someone who spent his life dismantling other people's empires. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, and his tailored navy suit betrayed no wrinkles. He did not handle divorces or petty civil disputes. Calvin specialized in high net worth estate litigation. He was a legal surgeon, known for extracting assets from hostile trusts with ruthless efficiency. He ushered me into his corner office. The room featured floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Philadelphia skyline, but my attention remained fixed on the long conference table dominating the space. "Take a seat, Diana," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "Let us see what you brought me." I opened my leather briefcase and retrieved the manila folder I had compiled the night before. I slid it across the polished wood. Inside lay the printed copies of my grandmother's original trust bylaws, the offshore routing numbers traced to the sports betting clearinghouse, and the bank withdrawal slips bearing my father's clumsy forgery. Calvin opened the folder. He did not ask me how I felt. He did not offer sympathetic platitudes about the tragedy of family betrayal. He simply retrieved a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, slipped them on, and began to read. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the office was the crisp turning of paper and the faint rhythmic ticking of a silver desk clock. I watched his eyes scan the documents, tracking his micro-expressions. A slight narrowing of the eyes here, a sharp intake of breath there. When he reached the final page, displaying the forged signatures, he paused for a long time. He removed his glasses and placed them deliberately on the table. He folded his hands, leaning back in his chair. "Your father was not particularly clever," Calvin stated, his tone conversational but laced with clinical precision. "This is sloppy work. The signature deviation is glaring. Any competent forensic graphologist would tear this apart in 10 seconds. But the mechanism of the theft is what interests me. Arthur Gable overriding the security protocols at the local branch. That is the vulnerability we are going to exploit." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Tell me our options." "Standard protocol for an estate dispute is to file a civil lawsuit," Calvin explained, charting the path with his hands. "We would file a complaint in county court alleging breach of fiduciary duty. We would subpoena the bank records formally. We would depose your father, your brother, and the bank manager." "How long does that take?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be unacceptable. 18 months to 3 years, Calvin replied without hesitation. "During that time, your parents will hire their own defense counsel. They will drag their feet during discovery. They will attempt to settle for pennies on the dollar. More importantly, it gives them ample time to hide whatever assets they have left. They could transfer property, empty retirement accounts, and claim bankruptcy before a judge ever issues a ruling. Lawsuits afford the guilty the luxury of time. I cannot wait 3 years, I said, my voice steady. Leo threatened to go to the hospital board tomorrow. They are actively trying to destroy my career right now. I need an immediate disruption. Calvin offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. He appreciated a client who understood the value of aggression. Good, he said, because this is not a civil dispute, Diana. What your father committed is felony wire fraud, identity theft, and severe fiduciary breach. This crosses the line into a criminal enterprise. We are not going to file a lawsuit. We are going to execute an ambush. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a thick, textured piece of legal stationery. He set it between us. We bypass the courts entirely for now. Calvin continued. I am going to draft a single certified letter, a notice of fiduciary breach and demand for restitution. It will outline every single statute your father violated. It will name Arthur Gable as a co-conspirator. It will detail the offshore wire transfers to the gambling syndicate. What is the demand? I asked, tracing the edge of the mahogany table. We give them a strict 72-hour deadline, Calvin said, his eyes locking onto mine. We do not demand cash because we know the cash is already gone, gambled away by your brother. Instead, we demand signatures. We attach an irrevocable assignment of proceeds to the letter. This document legally forces your parents to transfer the deeds of their primary assets, their Appalachian vacation cabin, and the boat your father cherishes, into an escrow account controlled by my firm. And if they refuse, I prompted, feeling the immense weight of the strategy settling over the room. If they fail to return the signed assignment within 72 hours, Calvin said softly, I package these forged bank slips, the offshore routing data, and a formal complaint, and I hand-deliver them to the Pennsylvania District Attorney. Your father will not receive a civil summons. He will receive a knock on his door from state investigators bearing federal warrants. The silence returned to the office, heavier this time. The strategy was brilliant. It was a flawless, inescapable trap. Calvin was offering me a legal guillotine. By placing the deadline at 72 hours, we stripped Hector and Carmen of the ability to strategize. They would not have time to hire a defense attorney to tie us up in red tape. They would have to choose between their beloved social status symbols or the terrifying reality of a criminal indictment. But holding the power to ruin someone is a heavy burden, even when they deserve it. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city traffic crawl like tiny metal insects far below. A fierce internal struggle waged behind my ribs. Sending this letter was the point of no return. Once the postal worker scanned that barcode, my father became a target for the federal penitentiary. The man who taught me how to ride a bicycle, the man who clapped at my college graduation. I felt the deep conditioned urge to protect him, the societal whisper telling me that daughters must be forgiving, that blood requires endless grace. Then the memory of the parking garage washed over me. I saw Leo standing in the cold yellow light, his face twisted in entitlement, threatening to burn my livelihood to ashes while hiding behind our parents' lies. I remembered Aunt Lucia's text, calling me greedy, while my stolen inheritance sat in an offshore casino account. I realized that my family had already crossed the point of no return. They crossed it the moment Hector traced the letters of my name onto a fraudulent withdrawal slip. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my administrative pen. The barrel was bright red, the color of corrections, the color of finality. Draft the letter, I said, uncapping the pen. Calvin nodded. He slid a retainer agreement across the desk, marking the locations requiring my authorization. This will shatter whatever illusion of family you have left, he warned gently, a rare moment of humanity breaking through his surgical demeanor. Once I send this, they will look at you as an enemy combatant. The fallout will be profound. They made me an enemy the day they robbed me, I replied. I am just finally returning fire. I pressed the red ink against the thick paper, signing my actual fluid signature on the dotted line. The movement felt liberating. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the creditor, and I was calling in the debt. Calvin gathered the paperwork, his movements crisp and efficient. He placed the signed authorization into a fresh envelope, sealing it with a definitive swipe of his hand. The letter goes out in the afternoon post, he confirmed, standing up from his chair. It will require a certified signature upon delivery. The moment they sign for it, the 72-hour countdown begins. Go back to work, Diana. Turn your phone volume up. When the mail arrives at their house, you are going to hear the explosion. I left the law firm and walked back out into the brisk Philadelphia air. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The trap was set, the bait was placed, and the mechanism was primed. All I had to do now was wait for the postal carrier to knock on my parents' pristine suburban front door. The next 24 hours required a level of psychological endurance I usually reserve for hostile corporate audits. I returned to my office at the medical center on Wednesday morning, slipping back into the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets and vendor negotiations. The hospital hummed around me, a predictable ecosystem of beeping monitors, rushing nurses, and the sharp scent of antiseptic. I projected total clinical calm. I sat in strategy meetings, nodded at appropriate intervals, and approved equipment requisitions with steady hands. But beneath my tailored blazer, my pulse kept a different, much tighter cadence. Somewhere on the highways of Pennsylvania, a United States Postal Service truck was carrying a thick certified envelope bearing the letterhead of Pierce and Associates. A paper bomb was traveling toward my parents' pristine suburban neighborhood, ticking down the miles. At 9 a.m, my phone vibrated on my desk. I glanced at the screen expecting the delivery notification. Instead, it was an alert from Facebook. I rarely use social media, maintaining only a sparse profile for professional networking. Hector, however, treats his timeline like a curated museum of his own success. He uses it to broadcast his manufactured reality to his country club friends, his business associates, and our extended family. The notification informed me that Hector Mendoza had tagged me in a new post. I opened the application, my stomach tightening. There was a fresh photograph of Leo and Hector standing on the 18th hole of their exclusive golf course. They were both smiling, wearing crisp polo shirts, looking like the pinnacle of American prosperity. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in passive manipulation. "So proud of my son for launching his new venture today," the text read. "True success requires grit, loyalty, and standing by the people who raised you. We weather the storms together. Some children build, others abandon." He had deliberately tagged my dormant profile at the very end of the caption. The audacity of the post was staggering. My father had literally forged my signature to steal nearly $500,000, handed my future over to an offshore sports betting syndicate, and was now publicly demanding applause for his loyalty. He was actively constructing the narrative of my betrayal in real time, making sure every aunt, uncle, and local neighbor saw me as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family in their hour of need. A sharp, searing heat rose in my chest. The instinct to type a reply to scorch his comment section with the truth about Arthur Gable and the forged withdrawal slips was nearly overwhelming. I wanted to tear down his pristine digital facade and expose the rot underneath. But I pulled my hands away from the keyboard. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile hospital air fill my lungs. Engaging in a public shouting match was exactly what Hector wanted. He thrived on chaotic emotional warfare because it clouded the facts. If I commented, I would look unhinged. I would play right into the unstable persona he had designed for me. I locked my phone and slid it into my desk drawer. I would adhere strictly to the rule of silence. The truth did not need a Facebook comment. The truth was currently out for delivery. At 10:14 in the morning, my computer chimed with a priority email alert. I clicked the notification. It was the tracking update from the Postal Service. The status read, "Delivered." Below the timestamp was a digital copy of the signature required for receipt. Carmen Mendoza. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair, staring at the cursive loops of my mother's handwriting on the screen. The trap had officially sprung. I pictured her standing at the heavy oak door of their suburban colonial, wearing her tennis attire, signing the carrier electronic pad with a polite smile. I imagined her walking back into her designer kitchen, slicing open the thick premium envelope with a silver letter opener. I visualized her unfolding the heavy parchment, expecting a mundane tax document or a country club newsletter, only to read the words, "Notice of Fiduciary Breach," and "Demand for Restitution." Then the timeline stretched into a slow, agonizing crawl. 10:15, 10:30, 11 o'clock. Nothing happened. My phone remained dark. The silence was heavier than any screaming match could ever be. I sat at my desk staring at the black screen of my mobile device, mapping out the psychology of their delay. Why were they quiet? Because it takes time to process the destruction of your own reality. It takes time for Carmen to read the legal statutes to see the words wire fraud and felony printed in unforgiving black ink. It takes time for her to call Hector at his manufacturing plant, her voice trembling, forcing him to rush home. I imagined the frantic scene unfolding in their kitchen, Hector ripping the paper from her hands, the color draining from his face as he realized Calvin Pierce had acquired the bank records. The sudden, desperate phone call to Arthur Gable, demanding to know how the lawyers got the withdrawal slips, only to find that the corrupt bank manager was no longer taking his calls. And finally, the confrontation with Leo. The moment my parents demanded the remaining cash to pay back the trust, only to watch their golden boy break down and confess that the money was not tied up in real estate. It was gone, evaporated into the digital ether of an offshore casino. It took them exactly 88 minutes to realize they were cornered. At 11:42, my phone erupted. The screen lit up with Hector's contact photo. The device vibrated across the wooden surface of my desk like a captured insect. I did not reach for it. I sat perfectly still, watching the incoming call screen flash until it finally diverted to voicemail. 10 seconds later, the phone rang again. This time it was Carmen. Then it was Leo. Then Hector again. The digital panic was instantaneous and relentless. The calls stacked on top of one another in a chaotic, desperate rhythm. I waited until the barrage paused, then I accessed my voicemail inbox. I put my headphones on, ensuring my office door was closed, and listened to the sound of their fortress collapsing. The first message was from Hector. His voice was loud, attempting to project his usual patriarchal authority, but a distinct, ragged tremor betrayed his terror. "Diana, pick up the phone right now. I just received a ridiculous letter from some ambulance chaser in the city. You have lost your mind. If you think you can extort your own father with these fabricated allegations, you are gravely mistaken. I will countersue you for harassment. I will drag you through court. Call me back immediately and call off your attack dog before I ruin you." He ended the call with a forceful click. It was a pathetic display of posturing. He was trying to roar, but he sounded like a man standing on a trapdoor. The second voicemail was from Carmen. Her approach was the exact opposite of Hector. She utilized the weapon she had honed over decades: guilt. "Diana, please," she sobbed, her voice thick with authentic, panicked tears. "What are you doing to us? Why are you trying to destroy our family? We gave you everything. I sat up with you when you had fevers. We paid for your braces. We loved you. Leo made a mistake, but we were just trying to survive. Please, sweetheart, do not do this to your father. His blood pressure cannot handle this. Pick up the phone and let us handle this as a family." She did not apologize for the theft. She did not apologize for the forged signature. She only weaponized my childhood, demanding that I absorb their crimes to protect her comfort. The third message was from Leo. The golden boy was entirely fractured. The smooth, charismatic tone he used in the parking garage was replaced by a shrill, breathless panic. "Diana, you cannot do this. You have to stop the lawyers. Dad is losing his mind. He is talking about selling the boat. He is blaming everything on me. You know I have a gambling problem. You know I am sick. You are trying to send me to jail. You are destroying my life over money you do not even need. Answer the phone." I sat in the quiet of my office, letting the 3 recordings sit heavily in my mind. Hector chose rage. Carmen chose martyrdom. Leo chose victimhood. None of them chose accountability. They had finally realized the 72-hour deadline was not a negotiation tactic. It was a countdown to their mutual destruction, and they did not have the funds to buy their way out. I want to pause and ask you a question. If you were sitting in my chair staring at those 3 voicemails, what would you do? Option A: pick up the phone, throw their lies back in their faces, and gloat over their panic. Or option B: put the phone on silent and let them sweat in the dark. Tell me your choice in the comments. I chose option B. I deleted the voicemails, placed my phone face down on the desk, and returned to my budget reports. The most terrifying response you can give to a manipulator is total, unbroken silence. Depriving them of an audience starves them of their power. By 3 p.m, the calls abruptly stopped. The sudden quiet was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign of escalation. Hector Mendoza is a man who cannot tolerate being ignored. If his digital commands are disregarded, his fragile ego demands physical enforcement. He needs a target to intimidate. When he realized I was not going to answer his calls, he decided the phone was no longer sufficient. I left the hospital at 6 p.m, driving back to my quiet townhouse in the Lehigh Valley. I parked in my driveway, unaware that my father had already bypassed the digital boundaries I set. He had chosen desperate physical action, bringing the war directly to my front doorstep. I pulled into the driveway of my townhouse just as the sun dipped below the Pennsylvania tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. My neighborhood is a quiet enclave in the Lehigh Valley, characterized by manicured lawns, predictable routines, and neighbors who value privacy above all else. It is a sanctuary I purchased with my own hospital salary, far removed from the chaotic social climbing of my parents' community. I stepped out of my car, eager to shed my tailored blazer and wash the sterile hospital air from my skin. I wanted nothing more than a quiet evening to decompress from the adrenaline of the day. I barely had time to set my briefcase on the entryway table before a heavy thud of fists hit my front door. The sound was not a polite neighborly knock. It was a rhythmic, demanding pounding that rattled the brass fixtures and vibrated through the floorboards. My pulse quickened, a sudden spike of defensive energy flooding my system. I walked down the short hallway, my low heels silent on the hardwood, and peered through the glass peephole. Standing on my welcome mat were Hector and Carmen Mendoza. They looked entirely out of place in my quiet cul-de-sac. Hector wore his expensive golf attire, but the crisp collar was askew and his face was flushed and angry mottled red. Carmen stood slightly behind him, wringing her hands, her designer handbag clutched tight against her chest like a shield. They had driven over an hour from their pristine suburb, bringing the panic I had ignited directly to my doorstep. I took a slow, measured breath, grounding myself. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door inward. However, I did not touch the latch on the reinforced steel security screen. The heavy black mesh remained locked firmly in place between us. That screen was a physical manifestation of my new reality. It was an impenetrable boundary separating my safe, logical world from their erratic desperation. "Diana, open this screen right now," my father ordered. His voice carried the booming, authoritative cadence he used to command his factory floor workers. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at my face, jabbing the air just inches from the steel mesh. "You are going to pick up your phone, call that attack dog lawyer of yours, and tell him this was a terrible misunderstanding. You do not treat your father like a common criminal." I stood in my foyer, my arms crossed defensively, looking at him through the tiny metal squares of the screen. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I did not flinch or step back. "I am treating you exactly like the man who forged my signature," I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. Hector opened his mouth to shout again, a vein throbbing prominently at his temple, but Carmen stepped in front of him. She deployed the exact weapon that had kept our family dynamic skewed for 3 decades. The tears. Her eyes welled up instantly, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. It was a tactic she had used my entire life to shield Leo from consequences and to force my compliance. "Please, sweetheart," Carmen sobbed, pressing her manicured hands against the cold steel screen. "You have to understand our position. Leo was in terrible trouble. He owed money to some very dangerous people down in the city. They were threatening him. What were we supposed to do as parents? Let them hurt your brother? We had to use the trust to save his life. We had no other choice. We were just trying to protect our boy." I watched her weep. A year ago, the sight of my mother crying on my porch would have shattered my resolve. I would have unlocked the door, offered her a glass of water, and apologized for making her so upset. I would have contorted my own logic to make her comfortable. Now, standing behind the locked screen, I watched her tears with the clinical detachment of a triage nurse evaluating a superficial scrape. "You did have a choice," I said, keeping my words perfectly level, refusing to let her emotional tide pull me under. "If Leo was truly in physical danger, you could have called me. You could have explained the situation and asked me to sign the withdrawal slips, legally. But you did not do that. You drove to the bank, bypassed the security protocols, and stole the funds in secret." Carmen sniffled, her hands dropping from the screen to clutch her purse. "We were trying to protect you from the stress of it all," she stammered, scrambling frantically for a foothold in a conversation she could no longer control. I did not let her find one. I leaned closer to the mesh, making sure she heard every single syllable. "Protecting me does not involve writing a sterile email to cut me off on my birthday," I stated. "Protecting me does not involve texting Aunt Lucia to smear my reputation across your entire social circle. You did not forge my name to save Leo from imaginary loan sharks. You forged it to save yourselves from the sheer embarrassment of raising a failed son. You spent my future to buy his silence, and then you tried to throw me to the wolves so no one in your country club would ask where the cash went." Hector stepped forward, pushing Carmen gently aside, his face twisting into a furious scowl. "How dare you speak to your mother that way?" he snarled, his voice rising in volume, echoing harshly off the brick facades of the surrounding townhouses. "We gave you everything you have. We put a roof over your head." Before he could launch into another practiced tirade about filial duty, the distinct, rhythmic squeak of a porch swing sounded from the property next door. I shifted my gaze past my parents' shoulders. Mr. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, had stepped out onto his front porch to retrieve his evening newspaper. He paused on his top step, holding the rolled paper in his hand, watching the loud commotion on my doorstep with blatant, unblinking curiosity. The evening was quiet enough that he could undoubtedly hear every word Hector was shouting. My father is a man pathologically obsessed with his public image. His entire identity, his self-worth, and his daily routine are constructed around being perceived as a wealthy, respectable patriarch holding total control over his domain. He felt my gaze shift, turned his head, and spotted Mr. Henderson watching them from across the manicured lawn. The transformation was instantaneous and pitiful to watch. The fiery red flush drained rapidly from Hector's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His broad shoulders slumped, shrinking inward as if trying to fold himself out of existence. The booming, factory boss voice evaporated into the cool autumn air. He was suddenly terrified of the public exposure, mortified that a stranger in a quiet neighborhood was witnessing his loss of control. The facade of the untouchable patriarch shattered under the gaze of an elderly man with a newspaper. He turned back to me, his posture defeated, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed whisper. "Diana, please," he hissed, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the neighbor. "Unlock the screen. Let us inside. We cannot discuss private family business out here in the open. People are staring at us." I looked at the man who had always seemed larger than life, the man who had dictated the terms of my existence since childhood. In that exact moment, stripped of his roaring authority and paralyzed by the judgment of a retired neighbor, he looked incredibly small. I realized with crystalline certainty that I held all the leverage. I possessed the one thing he valued more than money. I held the power to destroy his reputation. "There is nothing left to discuss inside Hector," I said evenly, making sure my voice was just loud enough to carry through the crisp evening air, ensuring he knew I was not afraid of being heard. I leaned closer to the steel mesh, locking my eyes with my father, delivering the final blow. "You have 48 hours left on Calvin Pierce deadline," I told him, enunciating every word with chilling clarity. "If the escrow transfer paperwork is not signed and delivered by then, the district attorney receives the forged bank slips. You can spend those 48 hours yelling on my porch, or you can spend them packing up your precious cabin. The choice is yours." I did not wait for his response. I did not wait for Carmen to start crying again. I stepped back, grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden door, and swung it shut. The solid wood blocked out the sight of their shocked, pale faces. I reached up and turned the brass deadbolt. The loud, metallic click echoed through the quiet foyer, sealing the fortress. I stood in the silence of my hallway, leaning my back against the cool wood of the door. Outside, I heard the faint, muffled sound of Carmen weeping, followed by the hurried, embarrassed footsteps of my father, marching her back down the driveway toward their luxury sedan. The engine started and the tires rolled away down the asphalt, taking their chaotic, toxic energy with them. The power dynamic had officially and permanently flipped. I was no longer the invisible, compliant daughter waiting for scraps of affection. I was the architect of my own defense, and I had just banished my attackers from my territory. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over me. I had won the skirmish on the porch. The line had been drawn, and I held the high ground. However, I knew my father too well to believe the war was truly over. Hector Mendoza does not surrender simply because he is cornered. When his pride is mortally wounded, he retaliates with everything he has left. He would not sign away his prized vacation cabin and his beloved boat without a vicious, bloody fight. Instead of yielding to the legal deadline, he would attempt to flip the board entirely. He would hire a lawyer of his own. He would try to drag me through the mud of the civil court system, hoping to bleed my resources dry before the criminal charges could stick. The next phase of the battle would not be fought on a front porch. It would be fought with legal filings, frozen assets, and weaponized family loyalties. The pressure was about to spike tremendously, and I needed to prepare for the inevitable counterattack. Hector Mendoza does not possess the emotional capacity to surrender. A man who has spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of supreme authority cannot simply fold his hand, even when checkmate is undeniably apparent on the board. Instead of yielding to the legal deadline established by Calvin Pierce, my father decided to double down. He chose retaliation. The retaliation arrived at exactly 2 o'clock the following afternoon. I was standing near the nurses' station on the surgical oncology floor, reviewing a supply manifest, when a security guard escorted a stranger toward me. The man wore a faded windbreaker and carried a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my identity. The moment I stated my name, he thrust the envelope into my hands, stated that I had been formally served, and walked away. The nurses around me fell silent, their eyes darting toward the documents in my hands. Being served legal papers in the middle of a prestigious medical center is designed to inflict maximum professional embarrassment. It is a calculated tactic meant to destabilize the recipient. I retreated to my office, locking the door behind me. I sat at my desk and broke the seal on the envelope. The header of the document bore the logo of Vincent Thorne, a notorious local defense attorney who built his career on relentless theatrical civil litigation. He is a strip mall gladiator, known for dragging out proceedings and bleeding opponents dry through frivolous filings. I read the initial complaint and my stomach plummeted. Hector was not merely suing me for emotional distress. He was petitioning the county court for an emergency injunction to freeze my personal bank accounts. The official charge listed on the court filing was elder financial abuse. The sheer audacity of the accusation made the sterile air in my office feel suffocating. Hector and his lawyer had crafted a fantastical narrative claiming that I had been systematically coercing my parents into turning over their retirement assets. They alleged that the missing trust fund money was actually spent on my lavish lifestyle, and that my current legal demands were a form of extortion targeting vulnerable senior citizens. It was a dizzying inverted reality. They were using the legal system to project their exact crimes onto me. If a judge granted the injunction, my checking and savings accounts would be locked. The salary I earned negotiating hospital contracts would be inaccessible. I would be unable to pay my rent or buy groceries. I flipped to the second page of the filing, and the final trace of my daughterly compassion withered and died. Attached to the complaint was a sworn, notarized affidavit. The signature at the bottom belonged to Carmen, the same woman who stood on my front porch weeping, begging me to remember how she cared for me when I had childhood fevers, had just committed perjury to destroy my livelihood. My mother signed a legal document swearing under oath that I was a financial predator. The betrayal was staggering. I sat in my ergonomic chair staring at her looping cursive handwriting, realizing that there was no line they would not cross to protect their suburban illusion. As I processed the depth of their treachery, my phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed the name Sophia. She is my maternal cousin, a pragmatic emergency room nurse who always managed to hover above the toxic drama of the extended family. Sophia possesses a keen intellect and has always seen through the pristine facade that shielded my brother. I answered the call, keeping my voice neutral. Sophia did not bother with pleasantries. She told me the Mendoza household had devolved into an active war zone. The united front my parents attempted to project was crumbling under the immense pressure of the looming criminal deadline. Leo had managed to intercept a copy of Calvin Pierce's demand letter before Hector could shred it. When my brother read the words felony wire fraud and saw the timeline for district attorney involvement, his survival instincts overrode his supposed family loyalty. The unbreakable bond they so proudly paraded on social media was a sham. Sophia revealed that Leo was currently packing his belongings into his luxury sedan, threatening to turn state evidence against his own parents. He was screaming in their colonial kitchen, declaring that he would testify that Hector acted alone. Leo planned to claim he believed the offshore transfers were a legitimate business loan from his father, asserting total ignorance regarding the forged signatures. The familiar mantra of family helps family had dissolved into a pathetic scramble for self-preservation. Leo was willing to let Hector go to federal prison as long as he could escape the consequences of his own gambling debts. Hearing about the shattered porcelain and the screaming matches occurring in my childhood home, a sudden, heavy wave of conditioned guilt washed over me. Society places an immense burden on daughters to act as the ultimate peacemakers. We are taught from a young age to absorb the shock waves of our male relatives, to smooth over the cracks, and to prioritize the unity of the household above our own safety. For a brief, agonizing moment, I questioned my choices. A hollow ache bloomed behind my ribs. I wondered if I was the architect of this destruction. I wondered if I should just drop the legal pursuit and walk away empty-handed to stop the bleeding. Then I looked down at the court summons resting on my desk. I looked at the legal petition designed to freeze my bank accounts and starve me out of my own home. I traced my fingers over my mother-forged signature on an affidavit of lies. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable clarity. I was not tearing my family apart. Their unchecked greed, their profound arrogance, and their mutual willingness to throw each other under the bus were doing the demolition work. I was simply the mirror, reflecting their ugliness back at them. They built a house of cards, and they were punishing me because I refused to be the foundation anymore. I thanked Sophia for the information, hung up the phone, and took a deep breath to steady my nerves. I needed to call Calvin immediately to address the frivolous countersuit and the threat to my personal finances. I reached for the device, but before my fingers could tap the screen, it began to ring. The incoming call was from Pierce and Associates. I answered the call expecting Calvin to calmly discuss defensive strategies against Vincent Thorne. Instead, his voice carried a sharp, urgent edge I had never heard before. The surgical detachment was gone, replaced by the intense focus of a hunter who had just uncovered a much larger predator. He told me to sit down. He explained that while running a routine forensic sweep of the banking data to prepare for our defense, his accounting team stumbled across a glaring financial anomaly. The money withdrawn from my trust did not flow in a straight line to the offshore casinos. The battlefield was about to shift, and my father was guarding a secret far darker than a son with a gambling addiction. To understand the magnitude of my father's deception, you have to understand the source of his pride. Hector has spent the last 15 years serving as the chief financial officer for a regional manufacturing firm specializing in industrial valves. It is not a glamorous industry, but it provided the bedrock for his pristine suburban identity. That executive position funded the luxury sedans, the country club memberships, and the sprawling Appalachian vacation cabin he treasures above all else. He built an entire persona around being a pillar of local commerce, a man of unquestionable fiscal integrity. The clinical hum of the hospital ventilation system faded into the background as I pressed the phone against my ear. Calvin Pierce did not sound like a man preparing a standard defense against a frivolous countersuit. His tone possessed the sharp, focused energy of a predator that had just caught the scent of a much larger prize. He instructed me to sit down and open my encrypted email portal. I clicked the link he sent me. A highly detailed forensic accounting ledger populated my screen. Calvin explained that his team had spent the last 48 hours executing a deep dive into the wire transfers to prepare our defense against Vincent Thorne. They needed to map the exact trajectory of every stolen dollar to prove my parents were the sole beneficiaries of the fraud. They expected to see a straight line leading directly to the offshore sports betting syndicate in Antigua. Instead, they found a fork in the road. "Look at the third page," Calvin instructed, his voice radiating a grim satisfaction. "Look at the routing numbers for the final 2 transfers." I scrolled down the spreadsheet. The first $350,000 followed the anticipated path, disappearing into the digital ether of Leo and his disastrous wagers. But the remaining $100,000 diverged. Those funds were wired to a domestic account linked to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. I asked Calvin who owned the shell company. He did not hesitate. "Hector Mendoza," he replied. "He is listed as the sole proprietor, and if you look at the disbursement records from that shell account, the money did not stay there long. It was routed directly into the primary operating accounts of your father's manufacturing firm." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The puzzle pieces rearranged themselves, forming a picture so depraved it made my skin crawl. "Hector did not steal my trust fund merely to save his golden boy from the consequences of a gambling addiction. The truth was infinitely more calculated. My father was drowning in his own corporate crimes. He had been quietly embezzling funds from his employer for months, skimming from the corporate ledger to maintain the lavish lifestyle he felt he deserved. As the fiscal quarter drew to a close, an internal audit was looming. He desperately needed liquid capital to balance the books and cover his tracks before the auditors arrived. When Leo came crying to him about his immense losses at the sportsbook, Hector did not see a tragedy. He saw a convenient, chaotic smokescreen. My father realized he could drain my entire inheritance and blame the missing total on his son's addiction. Leo was the perfect scapegoat. Everyone knew Leo was irresponsible. Everyone would believe that the golden boy had gambled away $500,000. Hector used my brother's genuine sickness to mask his own profound financial rot. He sacrificed my future, weaponized my brother's failure, and painted himself as the tragic patriarch holding the family together, all while pocketing $100,000 to save his own skin. A deep, visceral nausea twisted in my stomach. The layers of deception were staggering. My parents were willing to smear my name across their entire social circle, allowing Aunt Lucia and the neighbors to view me as a predator just to protect a corporate embezzler. Carmen signed an affidavit claiming I was abusing them financially, knowing full well her husband was filtering stolen cash through a shell corporation. "This changes the entire landscape," Calvin stated, pulling my attention back to the legal reality. "What your father committed is no longer just local fraud. By routing stolen funds across state lines into a Delaware shell company and then using them to cover up corporate theft, he has triggered interstate commerce laws. We are looking at federal corporate embezzlement." I stared at the numbers on my monitor. "What happens if this goes to a judge?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "If this reaches a courtroom," Calvin replied with chilling certainty, "your father will not just lose his country club membership. He will face a minimum of a decade in a federal penitentiary. The hospital board threats from Leo are irrelevant now. Vincent Thorne and his frivolous countersuit are irrelevant. You hold the kill shot, Diana. The power dynamic had not just flipped. It had shattered the entire board. I asked Calvin what our next move should be. I expected him to suggest marching straight to the authorities, but Calvin is an estate litigator who understands the value of psychological warfare. He knew that destroying Hector in a courtroom would take time, and it would drag my name through the mud of public record. The most effective way to eliminate a threat is to force them to dismantle their own empire. We invite them into the lion's den, Calvin said. I am going to contact Vincent Thorne right now. I will request an emergency mediation session at my office for tomorrow morning. I asked if Thorne would actually agree to meet, considering they believed they held the upper hand with their injunction to freeze my bank accounts. Calvin let out a dry, humorless laugh. Thorne will eagerly accept, he assured me. That man operates entirely on ego. He will assume the prospect of frozen assets has terrified you. He will strut into my conference room believing you are ready to surrender, beg for mercy, and drop your claims to save your hospital salary. They have zero idea that we possess the shell company records. We are going to let them walk blindly into their own execution. I agreed to the plan, ended the call, and closed the encrypted email portal. I sat in the quiet of my office, listening to the distant hum of the medical center. A profound shift occurred within me. The residual sting of betrayal, the lingering sorrow of losing the family I thought I had, vanished. You cannot mourn a fortress when you realize it was always a prison. I spent the rest of my shift operating with a singular, icy focus. I reviewed contracts, authorized expenditures, and spoke to department heads with a calm that bordered on terrifying. I was no longer a daughter reeling from rejection. I was an auditor, preparing to balance a ledger that had been skewed for 33 years. That night, I drove back to my townhouse in the Lehigh Valley. I did not check my social media. I did not look at my blocked messages to see if Carmen had left any more weeping voicemails. I ironed my sharpest gray suit. I polished my shoes. I packed my leather briefcase, ensuring my favorite red administrative pen was secured in the front pocket. The morning sun rose, painting the Pennsylvania sky in shades of bruised purple and pale gold. I drove down the interstate toward downtown Philadelphia, navigating the heavy commuter traffic with steady hands. My mind was clear. The anxiety that had plagued me since my birthday was entirely gone. I parked in the underground garage beneath Pearson Associates. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to a different plane of existence. I stepped into the reception area, greeted the front desk staff, and walked directly toward the heavy mahogany doors of the primary conference room. I pushed the doors open. The stage was set. The sterile, intimidating room smelled of lemon polish and impending ruin. I took my seat beside Calvin, placing my leather portfolio on the polished wood. We sat in silence, waiting for the elevator bell to ring, waiting for Hector Mendoza and his sleazy defense attorney to strut into the room, entirely unaware that they were stepping into a trap from which there was no legal escape. The confrontation I had spent my entire life avoiding was finally here, and I was ready to bring the fortress down. The heavy double doors of the conference room swung inward, shattering the sterile silence of the 42nd floor. Vincent Thorne entered first. He moved with the unearned swagger of a local strip mall attorney who believed his own localized hype. His suit was a shade of blue that tried too hard to imitate true luxury, and his smile resembled a predator inspecting a trap he thought had already sprung. He tossed his scuffed leather briefcase onto the polished wood with a loud, theatrical thud, signaling his intent to dominate the space. Behind him walked my parents. Hector wore his finest charcoal business suit, the armor he reserved for hostile board meetings and country club disciplinary hearings. He squared his shoulders, thrusting his chest forward to project his usual patriarchal authority, but the facade was incredibly brittle today. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, catching the fluorescent light. His eyes darted nervously around the opulent office, taking in the panoramic views of the Philadelphia skyline, silently measuring his own local worth against Calvin Pierce and his undeniable metropolitan success. Carmen followed, trailing a few steps behind her husband. She looked remarkably diminished. The vibrant, commanding matriarch who usually orchestrated suburban charity galas was nowhere to be seen. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest like a flotation device, her gaze fixed firmly on the carpet. She refused to look at me. The tears she weaponized on my front porch were absent, replaced by a sullen, defensive posture. Noticeably missing from their procession was the golden boy. Leo was nowhere to be found. The brother who had cornered me in a parking garage, threatening to burn my hospital career to ashes, had vanished the moment the legal heat intensified. His absence spoke volumes, confirming everything Sophia had told me over the phone. The loyal family unit had fractured, leaving my parents to face the firing squad alone. They took their seats on the opposite side of the vast expanse of mahogany. The physical distance between us felt immense, a wooden canyon representing the chasm between who we used to be and what we had become. I sat perfectly still beside Calvin, keeping my posture rigid and my expression entirely unreadable. Thorne unclasped his briefcase, pulled out a legal pad, and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and patronizing amusement. "We are here as a courtesy, Miss Mendoza," Thorne began, his voice dripping with condescension. "My clients are deeply distressed by the fracturing of their family. They understand that you are upset, perhaps even confused, about the nature of the financial arrangements made for your brother. However, the frivolous demands drafted by your counsel are simply out of the question. Furthermore, given the current injunction we filed to freeze your personal checking accounts, I think we all understand who holds the superior position today. We are here to offer you an elegant exit ramp." I did not blink. I did not offer him a single syllable of response. I let his words hang in the air, allowing the silence to stretch until it became uncomfortable. Thorne shifted in his seat, his smug smile faltering just a fraction at my lack of emotional reaction. He was accustomed to dealing with panicked family members, people who wept and bargained when faced with frozen assets. He did not know how to handle a hospital administrator who audited multi-million-dollar ledgers for a living. Hector cleared his throat, eager to reclaim the spotlight. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a single sheet of pristine white paper. He placed it on the table and pushed it across the smooth surface. The paper glided over the polish, coming to a rest precisely in the center of the table. "I want to put this ugly chapter behind us, Diana," my father said. He deployed his most reasonable paternal tone, the voice he used to scold me when I missed curfew in high school. "I am a fair man. Your mother and I have drafted a proposal. It is a generous offer considering the emotional distress you have caused this family over the past week. If you agree to these terms and sign a full waiver relinquishing any future claims against the trust, I will instruct Vincent to withdraw the injunction on your bank accounts immediately. You can go back to your life, and we can go back to ours." I looked down at the document. It was titled Settlement Plan and Resolution. Below the legal jargon was a simple grid detailing a proposed schedule of payments. My father was offering to repay the stolen $450,000 in monthly installments of exactly $500. There was no interest applied. There was no collateral listed. It was nothing more than an unsecured promise written on a piece of paper. A cold, hollow sensation expanded in my chest, rapidly followed by a fierce, undeniable wave of clarity. The sheer insult of the offer was breathtaking. $500 a month. That amount would barely cover a fraction of my monthly rent. It was not a settlement. It was a hostage negotiation. He was attempting to hold my own salary ransom in exchange for a literal slap in the face, expecting me to grovel just to regain access to my grocery money. Calvin Pierce reached out and pulled the paper toward him. He did not put on his reading glasses. He merely glanced at the numbers, a dark amusement dancing in his eyes. $500 a month, Calvin stated, his resonant baritone, slicing through the tension in the room. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a single manicured finger against the mahogany armrest. Let us do some basic arithmetic, Hector. $500 a month equates to $6,000 a year. If we divide the principal amount you extracted from the trust by 6,000, we arrive at a figure of 75 years. Calvin dropped the paper back onto the table. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud. You are a man in your late 60s, Calvin continued, locking his gaze onto my father. 75 years means this debt reaches maturity well past your centennial. Will you be mailing these checks via seance, Hector? Or do you expect my client to wait until the next century to recover the inheritance you stole to cover your own corporate indiscretions? The color vanished from Hector's face. The word corporate hung in the air for a fraction of a second, an intentional, razor-sharp warning shot fired across the bow. Thorne frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. His client had not informed him about any corporate issues. That is all we can afford to liquidate right now, Hector snapped, his voice rising in defense, trying to recover his footing. The funds are tied up in complex investments. We are offering a guaranteed stream of income. Diana should be grateful we are willing to negotiate at all, given her horrific behavior. I reached into the front pocket of my leather portfolio. My fingers found the smooth, familiar plastic barrel of my red administrative pen. I pulled it out, resting it in the palm of my hand. I thought about the hours I spent sitting at my kitchen island, agonizing over the zero balance in my bank account. I thought about Leo, cornering me in the parking garage, his breath sour, threatening my career. I thought about the forged withdrawal slips sitting in the encrypted file, and the $100,000 funneled into a Delaware shell company to mask a profound criminal rot. I uncapped the pen. The soft click echoed in the quiet room. I picked up the settlement offer. I did not look at the numbers again. I looked directly into my father's eyes. He stared back, trying to maintain his mask of authority, but the heavy perspiration on his forehead betrayed his escalating panic. I did not see the man who raised me. I saw a delinquent account. I saw a hostile liability that needed to be zeroed out. I leaned forward, pressing the felt tip of the pen against the paper. The red ink bled into the white fibers. I drew a single, thick, unforgiving line straight through the signature he had placed at the bottom of the document. I struck out his name with the exact same ruthless precision I used to eliminate predatory clauses in vendor contracts. The payment plan is rejected, I said, my voice echoing off the frosted glass walls. I slid the ruined document back across the table. It came to a rest directly in front of Vincent Thorne. You seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship, Hector. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his. I am not your daughter anymore. A daughter might forgive this. A daughter might cry or beg or accept an insulting monthly stipend just to keep the peace. You ensured that daughter ceased to exist the moment you practiced tracing my name onto a withdrawal slip. Carmen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She finally looked at me, her eyes wide with shock, realizing that the emotional levers she relied upon were permanently broken. I am your primary creditor, I stated, enunciating every syllable with chilling finality. And you are in default. Filing that frivolous lawsuit to freeze my checking accounts was the worst tactical mistake you could have made. You thought you were starving me out. In reality, you only forced my counsel to dig deeper into your financial history to prepare our defense. You sped up your own execution, Thorne scoffed, breaking the silence. He adjusted his collar, trying to project a confidence he was rapidly losing. He leaned over the table, attempting to intimidate me with his proximity. That is a very dramatic speech, Miss Mendoza Thorne, sneered, his voice laced with venomous sarcasm. But drama does not hold up in a court of law. We have an injunction in place. You have no access to your own capital. You are bleeding out, and we have all the time in the world. So tell me, what imaginary leverage do you think you hold that allows you to reject our generosity? I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached back into my portfolio, ready to pull the trigger on the trap we had meticulously set. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to match his theatrical volume or engage with his patronizing tone. I calmly opened the leather flap of my folio. The ambient noise of the city traffic far below seemed to fade, leaving only the crisp sound of my fingertips brushing against heavy parchment. I extracted 2 separate stacks of paper and placed them face down on the polished mahogany. I slid the first document across the wide table. It came to rest directly between my father and his arrogant legal counsel. "Read it," I instructed softly. Thorne let out a dismissive scoff, adjusting his cheap blue suit, but his eyes darted to the page. He reached out and flipped the document over. The official raised seal of a licensed notary public sat near the bottom right corner. Above that seal was a sworn, signed affidavit. The signature at the bottom of the page belonged to Arthur Gable. I watched my father process the name. His shoulders flinched. The warm color rapidly drained from his flushed cheeks, leaving behind a sickly ashen pallor. For the past decade, Arthur Gable had been his closest confidant at the local banking branch. They shared golf carts, complained about property taxes over aged scotch, and protected each other's secrets. But loyalty among suburban conspirators is a fragile construct. When Calvin Pierce had his private investigators contact Arthur earlier that week, outlining the severe federal penalties for wire fraud and offering a narrow window to cooperate in exchange for prosecutorial immunity, the bank manager did not hesitate. He traded his country club friend for a guarantee of freedom. The affidavit detailed everything. Arthur confessed to bypassing the dual authorization security protocols. He testified under oath that Hector orchestrated the withdrawal, leveraging their personal relationship to force the transaction through without my physical presence or my consent. A sharp, ragged gasp tore through the sterile air of the conference room. Carmen pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, darting from the notarized paper to her husband's face. She was searching for a denial, waiting for Hector to declare the document a forgery. But Hector remained entirely mute. The pristine shield of his reputation was cracking wide open right in front of her. Thorne frowned, his bravado beginning to splinter. "A rogue bank manager is a problem," he muttered, trying to maintain his footing. "But it does not negate the fact that your brother gambled the funds away. It is still a family dispute over a mismanaged loan." I did not argue. I simply placed my hand on the second stack of papers and slid it forward. "This is a forensic trace compiled by a certified public accountant." I stated, my tone resembling a surgeon discussing an incurable diagnosis. "It maps the precise trajectory of every single dollar stolen from the trust account." Thorne picked up the ledger. He scanned the first page, noting the large transfers routed to the offshore betting syndicate in Antigua. A smug hint of vindication flashed across his face. Then he turned to the third page. I watched the exact moment the local defense attorney realized he had walked into a slaughterhouse. His eyes locked onto the highlighted routing numbers. He saw the $100,000 diversion. He read the name of the Delaware Shell Corporation. He traced the final destination of those funds straight into the primary operating accounts of the industrial valve manufacturing firm where my father served as chief financial officer. Thorne stopped breathing. The papers trembled slightly in his grip. He was a man who built his career on frivolous civil suits and localized bullying. He was entirely unequipped to handle federal corporate embezzlement. Filing an injunction based on claims of elder abuse on behalf of a man actively laundering stolen money to cover up corporate theft transformed Thorne from a legal advocate into an unwitting accessory to a federal crime. If he continued to represent Hector, he risked disbarment and criminal conspiracy charges. Thorne dropped the ledger onto the table as if the paper were engulfed in flames. He turned his head slowly, glaring at my father. The expression on his face contained pure, unadulterated loathing. "You lied to me." Thorne whispered the words, hissing through his teeth. "You sat in my office and swore this was a simple domestic dispute over an ungrateful child. You never mentioned a shell company. You never mentioned filtering money into your employer's accounts." Hector opened his mouth, stammering, struggling to formulate a coherent sentence. "Vincent, please, we can explain this. It was a temporary liquidity issue." Thorne did not wait for the explanation. He reached out, grabbed his scuffed leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp, metallic sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket with jerky, agitated movements. "I am withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately," Thorne announced to the room. He did not look at me or Calvin. He turned his back on his former clients and marched toward the heavy double doors. The doors swung open and shut, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in his wake. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing finality. My parents were sitting alone on their side of the vast mahogany expanse. They had no lawyer. They had no golden boy to blame. They had no fabricated narrative left to hide behind. The illusion of the wealthy, respectable suburban patriarch had been surgically dismantled, exposing the terrified, cornered thief underneath. I looked at Carmen. My mother was staring at her husband. The woman who had spent decades enabling his arrogance, covering his flaws, and weaponizing her tears to maintain their social standing, finally saw the truth. She realized Hector had not stolen my future to save their son. He had sacrificed both of his children to save his own corporate skin. There were no tears left in her eyes. The emotional manipulation she relied upon her entire life was utterly useless in the face of cold, mechanical leverage. Her gaze turned hollow, reflecting the death of her pristine, suburban dream. I picked up my red administrative pen from the table. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the smooth plastic before tossing it gently across the wood. It rolled and came to a stop right next to my father's clenched fist. Calvin Pierce reached into his own portfolio. He produced a single legally binding document and slid it toward Hector. It was the irrevocable assignment of proceeds. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. "Sign the document, Hector," I commanded. "Sign the deed to the Appalachian cabin and the title to your boat into the escrow account controlled by this firm right now. If you hesitate, if you attempt to negotiate, or if you pick up that pen and put it back down, Calvin will hand-deliver both of these files to the district attorney before lunch." Hector stared at the red pen. His breathing was shallow, rapid. He looked at me, searching my face for any lingering trace of the compliant, invisible daughter he had raised. He searched for a hesitation, a flicker of conditioned guilt, a crack in my armor he could exploit. He found nothing. I was a blank ledger, and he was a deficit requiring immediate collection. Slowly, agonizingly, His right hand crept toward the red pen. His fingers trembled so intensely he could barely secure a grip on the barrel. He pulled the legal document closer. He pressed the felt tip to the signature line. The silence in the room was absolute as Hector Mendoza signed his name. He did not use the confident, sprawling signature he utilized to forge my withdrawal slips. This signature was small, jagged, and broken. He relinquished his most prized social assets, the foundational pillars of his false identity, trading his wealth for a fragile guarantee of freedom. He dropped the pen. The empire of lies officially fell, collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Calvin pulled the signed document back across the table, inspected the ink with professional precision. He nodded once, placing the paper into a secure folder. The immediate legal threat was neutralized, but the war was far from over. Signing the deeds was merely a private surrender inside a closed room. The true punishment would arrive during the execution of the settlement. The Appalachian cabin was the crown jewel of their social identity. Putting it on the market meant planting a giant flag of financial distress in the middle of their conservative community. The neighbors would notice. Aunt Lucia would ask questions. The carefully curated narrative my parents had spun about my greed was about to collide with the very public, undeniable reality of their sudden liquidation. The battleground was shifting from the courtroom to the neighborhood, and the social fallout was going to be devastating. The execution of a legal settlement is a remarkably sterile process considering the profound human devastation it leaves in its wake. There are no dramatic courtroom speeches, no gavels striking wooden blocks, and no weeping juries. There is only the swift, undeniable transfer of paper. Within 48 hours of the mediation session in Philadelphia, Calvin Pierce initiated the liquidation. His team moved with surgical precision. They filed the irrevocable assignment documents with the county clerk, transferring the title of Hector Mendoza's prized Appalachian mountain cabin into an escrow account. That cabin was not merely a piece of real estate. It was a monument to my father's ego, built from custom cedar logs and river stone nestled in the pristine Pennsylvania foothills. He spent the last decade using that property as a social bludgeon, casually mentioning the exorbitant property taxes at dinner parties just to ensure everyone at the table understood his net worth. It was the physical manifestation of the wealthy patriarch persona he had so carefully curated. On a crisp Thursday morning, a real estate broker drove a wooden stake into the manicured front lawn of that mountain sanctuary. A heavy metal sign swung in the autumn breeze bearing the words, "For Sale." The social fallout within their conservative suburban enclave was immediate, unforgiving, and entirely self-inflicted. Affluent communities operate on a fragile currency of perception. When a man like my father suddenly lists his most treasured asset for a quick cash sale, the neighborhood ecosystem senses blood in the water. The whispers began almost instantly. The rumors amplified the following afternoon, when a flatbed tow truck arrived at the local marina. Hector owned a 28-foot fiberglass cruiser he ostentatiously named the Dividend. He spent every summer weekend hosting fellow executives on that deck, pouring expensive scotch and cementing his local influence. The marina patrons stood on the wooden docks, watching in hushed fascination as a recovery crew hitched the boat to a heavy winch and dragged it out of the water. The vessel was hauled down the main thoroughfare of their suburb, a highly visible parade of financial ruin. My parents had spent weeks spinning a tragic narrative to the extended family, claiming I had selfishly drained their savings and left them destitute. They expected pity. They expected their social circle to rally around them in solidarity against the ungrateful daughter. But sudden, unexplainable asset liquidation does not inspire solidarity. it inspires suspicion. Aunt Lucia was the first to break ranks. She had previously sent me venomous text messages, accusing me of abandoning my parents, fully weaponizing the lie Hector had fed her. Now, the foundation of that lie was cracking under the weight of reality. My phone rang on a Saturday morning while I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing hospital supply chain logistics. I saw her name flashing on the screen and allowed the device to ring 3 times before picking up. I did not greet her warmly. I simply stated my name. "Diana, honey," Aunt Lucia began, her voice dripping with a cloying, fabricated sweetness that failed to mask her desperate curiosity. "I was just driving past the marina and I saw the strangest thing. Hector's boat was being hauled away by a brokerage firm, and Cousin Sophia mentioned she saw a listing for the mountain cabin online. Is everything all right with your father?" She was fishing for gossip. She wanted me to crack to offer a frantic defense or to confirm whatever scandalous theories were currently circulating at the country club. The old version of myself would have felt a desperate need to explain, to justify my actions, to present the forensic accounting and prove my innocence. I would have exhausted myself trying to manage her perception of me. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter roast. I adhered strictly to the boundary I had established. I offered no explanations. I presented no defenses. I engaged in zero drama. "I really cannot speak to their financial decisions, Lucia," I replied, my tone smooth and impenetrable. "You should ask Hector why he is selling." I ended the call before she could formulate a follow-up question. That strategic silence became the most devastating weapon in my arsenal. By refusing to engage in the mudslinging, I created an informational vacuum. In the absence of my defense, the community imagination ran wild. The neighbors and the extended family looked at the sudden sale of the cabin, the repo of the boat, and the abrupt cancellation of Carmen's autumn charity luncheon. They stopped viewing Hector as a generous victim and started viewing him as a man hiding a catastrophic secret. The social isolation my parents had tried to inflict upon me recoiled and swallowed them whole. They were trapped in their colonial home, suffocating under the weight of their own guilt and the judgmental stares of their peers. While my parents were enduring their suburban exile, a much darker reality was catching up with the Golden Boy. Leo had always relied on Hector to act as his impenetrable shield. Whenever one of his phantom startups failed, or whenever an angry investor came looking for returns, Hector opened his checkbook and made the problem disappear. My father funded the illusion of Leo's success to protect his own genetic legacy, but the shield was gone. The bank accounts were monitored, the trust was locked, and the assets were being liquidated by a ruthless Philadelphia lawyer. The offshore sportsbook in Antigua was not the only entity holding a marker on my brother. Gambling addiction rarely confines itself to a single platform. Leo owed money to regional bookies, high-interest credit cards, and unsavory private lenders he had convinced to fund his imaginary real estate ventures. These creditors operated with acute situational awareness. They heard the rumors echoing through the country club. They saw the mountain cabin hit the real estate listings. They realized the Mendoza family safety net had evaporated. They began calling Leo incessantly. When he stopped answering his phone, they started showing up at his luxury apartment complex. Sophia called me late one evening, her voice hushed, painting the chaotic picture of my brother's downfall. Leo had driven to our parents' house in a state of sheer terror, begging Hector for a final lifeline. He needed $30,000 to keep the local collectors from fracturing his jaw. Hector, stripped of his stolen funds and terrified of the looming federal embezzlement threat, turned him away. The father who had enabled the son for 3 decades finally closed the door. Realizing he was entirely unprotected, the Golden Boy broke. He did not pack suitcases. He grabbed industrial garbage bags from the kitchen pantry and stuffed them with designer clothes, expensive watches, and whatever loose electronics he could pawn. He loaded his sedan in the dead of night, casting paranoid glances at every set of headlights that passed his building. He left the keys to his apartment on the kitchen counter, abandoned his lease, and drove west toward the Ohio border. He fled Pennsylvania entirely, running from his debts, his lies, and the catastrophic wreckage he had helped create. The golden child, the undisputed pride of the family, was effectively banished. He traded his pristine reputation for a life on the run, leaving his aging parents to face the music alone. I watched the architecture of their lives collapse from a safe clinical distance. I did not feel triumph. I felt the profound, sterile satisfaction of an auditor watching a corrupted ledger finally balance itself. The funds began funneling back into my trust account a few weeks later. The process was agonizing and humiliating for my parents. The real estate market dictated the pace. First came a deposit of $80,000 from the sale of the boat. 2 weeks later, a wire transfer of $200,000 arrived after the cabin closed escrow. Each incoming deposit notification on my phone represented a piece of Hector pride being sold to the highest bidder. I watched the numbers tick upward, reclaiming the future they had tried to steal. Calvin Pierce handled the transaction logistics, ensuring every cent was accounted for and properly routed. He insulated me from their desperate emails and their frantic attempts to negotiate the remaining balance. I was shielded by ironclad legal boundaries untouchable in my Lehigh Valley townhouse. The financial ties were severing, cleanly slicing through the decades of manipulation and entitlement. The debt was being repaid. The legal threat was neutralizing Hector's ability to strike back. However, escaping a toxic family structure requires more than just recovering stolen capital. The money repairs the bank account, but it does not repair the narrative. My parents were still attempting to navigate their community, attending church services and walking through the grocery store dodging questions and projecting a fragile illusion of normalcy. The extended family remained fractured, whispering in corners, unsure of who was truly at fault. I knew that a quiet legal victory was insufficient. If I wanted to truly eradicate their influence over my life, I needed to confront the lie in the open. I needed to look the extended family in the eye and force them to acknowledge the truth. The opportunity for that final reckoning was rapidly approaching. A solemn family obligation was marked on the calendar, a gathering that neither Hector nor Carmen could avoid without admitting total defeat. The battleground was shifting one last time, setting the stage for a public confrontation that would permanently alter the family tree. 6 months passed before the final reckoning arrived. The seasons shifted across the Lehigh Valley, turning the bitter winter into a damp, gray spring. During those quiet months, the legal dust settled. The escrow accounts cleared, the property transfers became permanent public record, and my grandmother's stolen inheritance safely returned to my control. Calvin Pierce executed the final documents, severing my financial ties to my parents for good. I purchased a beautiful, modern home overlooking the dense Pennsylvania forests, laying the literal foundation for a new life. However, legal victories do not erase familial obligations. A death in the family mandated a physical reunion. Great-Aunt Mildred passed away in early April. She was a quiet woman who always sent birthday cards with crisp $5 bills inside, and her funeral brought the entire extended Mendoza tree back to our local parish. Funerals in our community are less about mourning and more about social posturing. They are grand stages where old grievances are whispered over plates of cold cuts and alliances are silently renegotiated. I arrived at the church reception hall wearing a tailored black dress, projecting the clinical, untouchable armor I had forged over the past year. The basement of the parish smelled of stale coffee, damp wool coats, and heavy floral arrangements. I stepped through the double doors and immediately scanned the perimeter. Hector and Carmen stood in the far corner of the room, positioned near a folding table holding a stack of memorial programs. They looked like ghosts, haunting their own lives. The physical toll of their public disgrace was profound. Hector, a man who once filled every room with booming authority and arrogant swagger, appeared shrunken. His expensive charcoal suit hung loosely off his shoulders, the fabric bagging around his waist. He stared at the linoleum floor, avoiding eye contact with the relatives passing by. Carmen stood rigidly beside him, her face tight and drawn. She lacked her usual vibrant jewelry, wearing a simple, unassuming cardigan that rendered her virtually invisible. They were pariahs in their own kingdom. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Pity is reserved for victims, and my parents were the architects of their own exile. I walked toward the beverage station, pouring a cup of dark roast coffee into a styrofoam cup. I knew the confrontation was coming. The extended family ecosystem abhors a vacuum, and someone needed to address the scandal out loud. Aunt Lucia appointed herself as the executioner. Lucia has always viewed herself as the moral compass of the family. She thrives on righteous indignation and relies on incomplete gossip to fuel her superiority. She had spent the last 6 months nursing a deep, festering resentment toward me, fully believing the initial lie my parents spun. She still thought I was the villain who forced her brother into near bankruptcy. She marched across the reception hall, her low heels clicking sharply against the floor tiles. She stopped directly in front of me, invading my personal space, her face pinched in a tight, judgmental scowl. "I cannot believe you had the nerve to show your face here today," Lucia whispered. Her tone was hushed to avoid drawing a crowd, but her words were laced with venom. I took a slow sip of my coffee, maintaining eye contact over the rim of the cup. "I am paying my respects to Mildred," I replied evenly. "You have no respect," Lucia hissed, leaning closer. "Look at your father. Look at what you did to him. You forced them to sell their beautiful cabin. You drove your own brother out of the state. They are living in a tiny apartment while you stand here looking pleased with yourself. You bankrupted the people who gave you life. Have you no shame?" A year ago, a public scolding from my aunt would have triggered a severe anxiety response. I would have stammered, defended myself, and begged for her understanding. I would have handed over my power to seek her approval. Standing in the church basement, I felt nothing but a cool, detached certainty. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic energy. I simply reached into my leather purse and retrieved my smartphone. I have a specific digital file saved on my home screen for this exact scenario. I unlocked the device, opened the secured PDF, and handed the phone to my aunt. "Read the first page, Lucia," I instructed calmly. She frowned, looking down at the glowing screen. Her eyes scanned the official letterhead. It was the sworn, notarized affidavit from the corrupt bank manager detailing how Hector used intimidation and bribery to bypass the dual authorization protocols. I watched Lucia read the words, describing how my father stole my inheritance. "Swipe left," I said. She swiped her finger across the glass. The second page displayed the forensic signature analysis. It provided undeniable visual proof that Hector traced my name onto the withdrawal slips, committing felony identity theft to access the vault. Swipe left again. The third page contained the financial ledger. It documented the exact routing numbers, proving the funds were wired to an offshore sports betting syndicate in Antigua to cover Leo and his disastrous gambling debts. There were no dangerous real estate investors. There was only a son throwing away $500,000 on roulette and football games. "Swipe one more time," I directed, delivering the final blow. The last page connected the remaining stolen funds to Hector and his corporate shell entity in Delaware. It outlined the corporate embezzlement, exposing my father as a man laundering money to hide his own professional crimes. I stood in silence, watching my aunt's worldview fracture in real time. The self-righteous anger that propelled her across the room evaporated, replaced by a profound, genuine horror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an unhealthy shade of chalk. Her hands began to tremble, causing the phone to shake in her grip. She realized that every cruel text message she sent me, every rumor she spread at her country club luncheons, was based on a monstrous fabrication. She had weaponized herself against an innocent target to protect a man who stole from his own child. Lucia handed the phone back to me. She could not look me in the eye. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. She turned away without offering an apology, stumbling slightly as she walked back into the crowd. The ripple effect was instantaneous. Lucia walked straight to my cousin Sophia and whispered frantically in her ear. Sophia nodded, her expression grim, confirming the facts. Lucia then moved to her husband, grabbing his arm, relaying the shattered narrative. The whispers multiplied, jumping from table to table, moving through the reception hall like a silent, invisible fire. The acoustic texture of the room shifted. The polite, muted conversations died out, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Every gaze in the parish basement slowly pivoted toward the far corner where my parents stood. Hector noticed the shift. A man obsessed with public perception possesses a radar for judgment. He felt the collective stare of the extended family pressing down on his shoulders. He looked up, his eyes meeting the horrified expressions of his sisters, his nieces, and his former allies. He knew that the truth had finally breached the walls of his carefully constructed fortress. Just as the social execution reached its peak, my phone vibrated in my hand. I looked at the lock screen. I had received a new email. The sender name displayed was Leo Mendoza. The brother who fled the state in the middle of the night to escape violent debt collectors was currently residing somewhere in the deserts of Nevada. He had not spoken to me since he cornered me in the hospital parking garage and threatened to destroy my career. I tapped the notification and read the message. It was a masterpiece of pathological delusion. Leo completely ignored the betrayal, the felony fraud, and the wreckage he left behind in Pennsylvania. He did not apologize for extorting me. Instead, he adopted the casual, breezy tone of a man asking to borrow a lawnmower. "Diana, hope you are doing well," the email began. "Things have been tough out west, but my luck is turning around. I found a surefire system at the tables out here. The math is flawless. I just need a small, temporary loan to stake my initial run. $5,000 would cover it. I will pay you back double by next week. Family helps family, right? Send it to this wire address." The entitlement was staggering. He was asking the sister he tried to ruin for gambling money, utilizing the exact same manipulative phrase our mother used to enforce compliance. It highlighted his total lack of growth and the tragic permanence of his addiction. He would never change because he was raised in an environment that insulated him from reality. I did not feel anger. I felt a profound sense of relief. The email was undeniable proof that walking away was the only correct choice. I did not type a response to Leo. I tapped the forward button on the email application. I entered my father's contact information into the recipient line. I tapped the screen, adding a single concise sentence to the top of the forwarded message. "Your son needs you. Good luck." I pressed send. I lifted my gaze, looking across the expanse of linoleum flooring toward the corner where my parents stood, isolated under the harsh fluorescent lights. I waited. 5 seconds later, Hector reached into the pocket of his sagging suit trousers. He retrieved his mobile device, responding to the notification chime. He tapped his screen and read the message. I watched the remaining fragments of his spirit collapse. The realization hit him with physical force. He understood. that his golden boy was still a parasite, operating on the exact same destructive programming. But this time, Hector had no stolen trust fund to dip into. He had no hidden corporate accounts to skim from. He had no wealthy facade left to leverage. Hector was the only host left, and Leo was going to drain whatever pennies remained in his downsized apartment. My father turned pale, his skin adopting the hue of wet ash. He did not look at me. He did not look at Aunt Lucia or the rest of the judging relatives. He reached out and grabbed Carmen by the elbow, his grip tight and desperate. They did not say goodbye to the grieving widow. They did not speak a single word to anyone in the hall. Hector led Carmen toward the side exit, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out into the cold Pennsylvania rain. They left their reputation in ruins on the reception hall floor, fleeing from a truth they could no longer outrun. The truth had done the heavy lifting, and I did not have to lift a single finger to finish the job. 7 days after the reception hall confrontation, the Postal Service delivered a final piece of correspondence. I stood in the bright kitchen of my new Lehigh Valley home, sorting through mundane utility bills and generic advertisements. Near the bottom of the stack sat a thick envelope made from premium cardstock. The return address was missing, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Carmen possesses a very distinct sweeping cursive practiced over decades of writing thank you notes for high society charity luncheons. I slid my finger under the flap and broke the seal. A faint scent of lavender perfume drifted upward. It was a calculated sensory trigger designed to evoke childhood nostalgia. I unfolded the heavy parchment and spread it flat on the granite island. The message inside was a masterpiece of passive martyrdom. My mother did not write to apologize for the forged withdrawal slips. She did not express remorse for standing by while my father funneled my inheritance into a corporate shell entity. Instead, she drafted an extensive indictment of my character. Diana, the letter began, skipping any affectionate greeting. I hope you are satisfied with the destruction you orchestrated. Your father is a broken man. His blood pressure has reached critical levels, and his physician warns us that the stress you inflicted might cause a fatal cardiac event. We are living in a nightmare stripped of our dignity while you sleep soundly in your new house. You looked at the people who gave you life, and you chose money over blood. I pray you find peace with your heartless decisions, because we have nothing left to give you. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, holding the scented paper in both hands. 12 months prior, reading those exact sentences would have induced a severe panic attack. The old version of myself would have absorbed the toxic guilt, dialed their number, and begged for a reconciliation. I would have offered to pay my father's medical bills. I would have convinced myself that holding them accountable was a mortal sin. Now I read her words with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. I saw the letter for exactly what it was. It was a desperate, final attempt to install a control mechanism in my mind. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever received an apology that was actually an accusation in disguise? Have you ever read a message where the person who wronged you twisted the narrative so tightly that they painted themselves as the tragic victim? Tell me how you handled it in the comments. I did not cry. I did not feel a single pang of regret. I walked into my home office and opened my desk drawer. I retrieved the same red administrative pen I used to strike out my father's ridiculous payment plan in the mediation room. I brought the pen to the heavy parchment and began to circle the manipulative phrases. I circled the mention of his blood pressure. I circled the phrase, choosing money over blood. I evaluated her guilt trip like a flawed hospital vendor contract, highlighting the logical fallacies and the emotional extortion. When I finished, the page was covered in red ink. I opened my filing cabinet, pulled out the folder labeled Hostile Liabilities, dropped the letter inside, and pushed the drawer shut. The emotional tether was officially severed. However, true closure requires more than just ignoring a letter. It requires dismantling the monuments your abusers built to celebrate their false superiority. A month later, the opportunity for ultimate poetic justice presented itself. Calvin Pierce called me with an update on the escrow accounts. The real estate market in the Appalachian foothills had cooled, and Hector-prized custom cedar log cabin was sitting unsold. The carrying costs were bleeding the escrow account dry. Calvin advised me to lower the asking price to force a quick sale and recover the remaining cash value. I looked out the window of my office, watching the spring rain wash the Pennsylvania streets. I realized that converting that property into liquid cash would be a tactical error. The cabin was the crown jewel of Hector's social identity. It was the physical embodiment of his arrogance. Selling it to a nice retired couple would allow the property to retain its dignity. I instructed Calvin to halt the sale. Using the leverage established in our settlement agreement, I executed a legal buyout. I transferred the remaining cash required to satisfy the escrow terms and assumed the deed personally. The mountain sanctuary no longer belonged to a holding company. It belonged to me. The following weekend, I drove up the winding mountain roads. The air grew thinner and colder as I ascended into the dense pine forests. I pulled into the gravel driveway and parked my sedan in front of the sprawling, rustic estate. The cedar logs were immaculately stained. The river stone chimney rose proudly against the gray sky. It was a fortress, built on stolen funds and corporate fraud. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The interior still held the faint aroma of Hector expensive cigars. I spent the afternoon clearing out the remaining traces of their existence. But my most important task took place on the front porch. I had brought a gallon of exterior paint and a wide bristle brush in the trunk of my car. I pried the lid off the metal can, revealing a vibrant, striking shade of crimson. I stood on the porch and began applying the bright red paint to the heavy oak front door. Hector had always maintained a strict, conservative aesthetic for the cabin, demanding natural wood tones to project old money sophistication. The unapologetic red door defaced that vision. It was a glaring, brilliant beacon signaling new ownership. It was the exact same shade as the ink I used to cross out his signature. I did not keep the cabin for my own personal retreats. I hired a local property management company and instructed them to list the estate on every major short-term vacation rental platform on the internet. I did not target families or quiet nature enthusiasts. I priced the sprawling property perfectly to attract large groups of college students looking for weekend getaways. Within weeks, the sacred generational status symbol was transformed into a bustling party hub. Busloads of rowdy fraternity members and bachelorette parties descended upon the quiet mountain enclave. They blasted loud music across the valley, dragged muddy hiking boots across the custom hardwood floors, and filled the pristine recycling bins with cheap beer cans. I sat in my spotless townhouse in the Lehigh Valley, watching the rental income flow steadily into my bank account. I was turning a significant profit while actively profaning the very asset my father used to project his superiority. The irony was exquisite. Every dollar earned from a noisy weekend rental felt like a direct tax levied against his ego. While the cabin hosted endless celebrations, the original owners were experiencing a very different reality. Stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their stolen liquidity, Hector and Carmen faced a brutal financial reckoning. The proceeds from the forced liquidations barely covered the restitution they owed me, and the staggering legal fees they incurred trying to fight Calvin Pierce. They could no longer afford the property taxes on their colonial home. They were forced to sell it at a steep loss to avoid foreclosure. They packed their remaining possessions into rented moving trucks and relocated to the edge of the county. They signed a lease at a sprawling gray stucco apartment complex situated next to a noisy interstate highway. The complex was known as Oak Creek Village. It was the exact same low-rent residential development Carmen used to mock during her charity luncheons. She used to drive past those identical stucco buildings, wrinkling her nose loudly, wondering how people could stand to live stacked on top of one another like cattle. Now she shared a thin wall with a noisy neighbor. Hector parked his sensible used sedan in an uncovered asphalt lot, miles away from the manicured greens of his former country club. Their world had shrunk to the size of a 2-bedroom unit with linoleum kitchen floors and rattling air conditioning vents. They were trapped in the precise environment they once utilized to feel superior. The universe possesses a remarkable sense of balance when you force it to reconcile the ledger. I had reclaimed my stolen inheritance, severed the toxic emotional bonds, and secured my own future. But as the seasons changed again, the story required one final closing chapter to cement the boundaries I had constructed. The past always attempts to knock on the door one last time, testing the strength of the new locks. The air in the Lehigh Valley changes when autumn bleeds into winter. It turns sharp and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke down from the ridges. I stood on the wraparound deck of my new home, wrapping both hands around a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. I purchased this property late in the year, using the recovered funds from my grandmother's trust. It was not a sprawling, ostentatious cabin meant to impress country club executives. It was a modern glass and timber structure built directly into the hillside overlooking miles of dense, ancient Pennsylvania forest. The architecture was clean, intentional, and bathed in natural light. Every single support beam, every pane of glass, and every square foot of hardwood belonged to me. There were no cosigners, there were no hidden clauses. I had severed the final legal hook my parents held in my flesh. Inside the house, the dining room hummed with a different kind of energy. I was hosting my first official dinner party. The guest list was meticulously curated. I did not invite blood relatives out of a sense of forced obligation or societal pressure. I invited the people who proved their worth through consistency and mutual respect. Calvin Pierce sat at the head of a long oak table, looking remarkably relaxed in a tailored gray sweater. He held a glass of Cabernet while debating healthcare policy with 2 of my closest hospital colleagues. Sophia, the cousin who navigated the family war zone to warn me about my brother, sat across from him, laughing brightly at a joke one of the surgeons made. I watched them through the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking a slow sip of my coffee. There was no underlying tension in the room. No one was performing for an audience. No one was calculating their next manipulative strike or guarding their words. We ate a roasted tenderloin, shared bottles of red wine, and told stories that did not involve maintaining a pristine suburban illusion. I realized, watching the firelight dance across the faces of my chosen circle, that I had never experienced a peaceful meal in my childhood home. Dinner with Hector and Carmen was always a performance review, a stage for my father to list his accomplishments while my mother critiqued my posture. Tonight, dinner was just dinner. I stepped back inside, sliding the glass door shut to seal out the winter chill. Sophia caught my eye and offered a warm, knowing smile. She understood the gravity of the evening. She knew the immense cost required to build this sanctuary. I will not lie to you and claim the transition into this new life was flawless. Healing is rarely a linear trajectory. It requires a conscious dismantling of old reflexes. For the first few months in the new house, I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. I would check my mailbox, expecting a frivolous lawsuit from Vincent Thorne. I would brace my shoulders when an unknown number appeared on my caller identification. Trauma wires the brain for constant vigilance, and it takes time to convince your own nervous system that the battlefield has been cleared. There are still moments, especially when the holiday season approaches, where a sudden sharp pang of grief catches me off guard. I walk through the aisles of the grocery store, see a display of festive decorations, and feel the phantom ache of the family I thought I deserved. I remember the smell of my mother baking during the winter, back when I was very young, before the facade hardened into a weapon. I remember the rare, fleeting moments when my father looked at me with genuine pride, before he decided my future was collateral for his corporate crimes. But a phantom ache is just a ghost. It is the memory of an illusion. I remind myself that the dull throb of their absence is infinitely lighter than the crushing daily agony of their exploitation. I traded the illusion of a family for the reality of my own survival. My survival meant leaving them to face the monster they meticulously nurtured. Through Sophia, I receive occasional unprompted updates about the occupants of Oak Creek Village. Hector and Carmen are still trapped in their ground-floor stucco apartment, listening to the relentless drone of the interstate highway rattling their cheap windows. Their social circle evaporated the moment the Appalachian cabin hit the market. The country club formally revoked their membership due to unpaid dues and the swirling rumors of federal investigations. But their true punishment is not the loss of wealth or status. Their true punishment is the Golden Boy. Leo did not stay in Nevada. The desert is unforgiving to gamblers who cannot cover their markers and lack the charm to secure new loans. He fled back to the East Coast, broke, desperate, and running out of options. With the trust fund drained and the corporate accounts locked by federal auditors, Hector had no money left to offer. But Carmen, driven by a pathological need to enable her son and preserve her identity as a savior, allowed Leo to move into the second bedroom of their cramped apartment. Now the three of them occupy 1,000 square feet of linoleum and thin drywall. Leo does not hold a job. He sleeps until noon, demands home-cooked meals, and constantly begs his aging parents for cash to fund his next imaginary venture. The tension inside that small unit is reportedly unbearable. They built their entire lives around a son who drains them, a parasite they trained to feed on their resources. They sacrificed their invisible daughter to protect him, and now they are locked in a cage with the exact reality they designed. There is no escape hatch left, no pristine luxury sedan to drive away in, no country club to retreat to. They are consumed by the consequences of their own enabling. If you are listening to this and you are sitting in a house that feels like a battlefield, I want you to pay very close attention. I know the profound fear that keeps you anchored to toxic people. I know the heavy, suffocating guilt that society places on your shoulders, whispering that blood is thicker than water, demanding that you absorb the abuse to keep the peace. I am here to tell you that peace, purchased with your own sanity, is just a delayed execution. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. You cannot reason with people who view your boundaries as an insult to their authority. When someone shows you that they are willing to forge your name, steal your future, or smear your character to protect their own fragile ego, you must believe their actions. You must stop waiting for an apology that will only arrive as an accusation in disguise. Walking away is not a failure of love. It is not a sign of weakness or a lack of resilience. Walking away is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It is the brave, necessary choice to stop setting yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm. You have the right to curate your own life. You have the right to close the door, turn the deadbolt, and refuse to answer when they knock. You owe no one your future, especially those who tried to spend it behind your back. I am 34 years old now. The sun is beginning to rise over the Lehigh Valley, casting long golden beams of light through the ancient pine trees surrounding my deck. I sit in the comfortable chair, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, listening to the morning songbirds wake up the forest. My smartphone rests on the wooden armrest beside me. The screen is dark. There are no frantic voicemails from a mother trying to weaponize my childhood memories. There are no threatening text messages from a brother looking to extort my career. There are no corporate termination emails from a father demanding blind compliance. For 33 years, the sound of my ringing phone was a trigger. It was a warning siren, signaling the next crisis, the next unreasonable demand, the next emotional extraction. Today, the phone sits in unbroken silence. I pick up my ceramic mug, taking a slow sip of the dark roast coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I look out over the sprawling Pennsylvania landscape, feeling the solid, unshakable ground beneath my feet. I did not just win my money back. I evicted my family from my mind. The silence is no longer a weapon used against me. It is a sanctuary I built with my own 2 hands, and the doors are permanently locked. We are sold a specific, deeply ingrained myth about the American family. It is a narrative wrapped in the warmth of holiday commercials and fiercely guarded behind the solid oak doors of suburban homes. The myth insists that blood is an unbreakable bond, that parental love is inherently pure, and that the ultimate measure of a successful family is its ability to stay together, regardless of the emotional or financial cost. But as the dust settles on the wreckage of the Mendoza family, a darker, more urgent truth emerges. The story of Diana, her brother Leo, and their parents, Hector and Carmen, is not merely a tale of financial theft and legal retribution. It is a tragic masterclass in the failures of modern parenting. It reflects exactly what happens when the traditional family structure is hollowed out by ego, stripped of emotional awareness, and built on the fragile foundation of neighborhood perception, rather than the bedrock of honesty and fairness. In American culture, we place an immense, almost pathological premium on success and appearances. For Hector and Carmen, their children were not independent souls to be guided. They were extensions of their own social equity. By designating Leo as the golden boy, they did not love him more. They actually loved him far less. True family responsibility requires the grueling, unglamorous work of holding our children accountable. It means allowing them to feel the sharp sting of their own mistakes. When Hector and Carmen constantly shielded Leo from the consequences of his irresponsibility, smoothing over his failures and covering his gambling debts with stolen trust funds, they were actively crippling him. They raised a man who believed the rules of the world were malleable, that his actions carried no weight, and that someone else would always be there to absorb his impact. Long-term guidance was abandoned in favor of short-term comfort. Conversely, we must examine the devastating reality of the invisible daughter. Diana was the responsible one, the child who navigated the cutthroat world of elite healthcare, asked for nothing, and built her own empire. In a healthy, emotionally aware family, her independence would be celebrated as the ultimate parenting triumph. Instead, her competence was weaponized. Because Diana did not demand constant rescuing, her parents assumed she required no emotional protection. Worse, they viewed her stability as an endless resource to be harvested. In families devoid of fairness, loyalty is frequently demanded by those who possess none of it themselves. The concept of familial devotion is twisted to mean that the strong must silently bleed to sustain the weak. Parenting is an exercise in emotional architecture. If you build a home where love is conditional, where affection is a currency doled out only to those who serve the patriarch's ego, you are not building a family, you are building a cartel. We must confront our cultural obsession with the pristine facade. Hector's Appalachian cabin and luxury boat were not just assets. They were the physical manifestations of his pride. In traditional American culture, we often confuse what we provide with how we parent. We mistake square footage for emotional safety. Hector and Carmen were so terrified of the judgment of their peers, so obsessed with projecting the image of a flawless lineage, that they were willing to commit felony fraud and publicly crucify their daughter to protect their secret. Honesty is the most terrifying virtue a parent can teach a child, because teaching it requires the parent to actually practice it. To raise an emotionally aware child, a parent must have the courage to say, "I was wrong. I failed." Hector and Carmen lacked this fundamental courage. They chose to live in a meticulously curated lie, and when that lie threatened to collapse, they tried to bury their daughter beneath the rubble. Stories like Diana's are uncomfortable precisely because they are not as rare as we pretend them to be. Behind many locked neighborhood doors, the same quiet battles between obligation and self-preservation are being fought. If you recognize the shadows in this narrative, if you see the ghosts of your own family dynamic in these words, I encourage you to follow Jessica Told Stories. We continuously explore the complex, often hidden realities of human relationships, survival, and the fierce journey to self-worth. Join our community because there is profound power in realizing you are not alone in the dark. And there is immense healing in finding the words for the pain you were taught to hide. This brings us to a conclusion that fundamentally challenges everything we are taught to believe about family and long-term guidance. Society dictates that a parent's ultimate failure is an estranged child. We view the empty chair at the Thanksgiving table as a mark of profound shame, a tragedy that must be avoided at all costs. We instruct children to forgive, to turn the other cheek, and to honor their mother and father blindly, regardless of the emotional or financial violence inflicted upon them. We are told that keeping the family together is the highest moral good. But what if conventional wisdom is entirely backward? What if the ultimate failure of parenting is not estrangement, but rather raising a child so desperate for your conditional love that they will allow you to completely destroy them? What if the real tragedy is the child who stays, who hands over their future, their sanity, and their self-worth just to keep the peace in a toxic home? We must embrace a new, radical philosophy regarding how we raise our children. The greatest, most profound triumph of parenting is inadvertently raising a child who possesses the immense, terrifying strength to walk away from you when you become the monster. Diana's ability to lock her door, to slide the red pen across the mahogany table, and to demand restitution without a single shred of conditioned guilt did not happen because of her parents' emotional guidance. It happened in spite of it. Yet it stands as the ultimate testament to human resilience. True parental success should not be measured by proximity or blind compliance. It is measured by the absolute autonomy of the adult you send out into the world. If you raise a child with enough self-respect to sever ties with anyone who abuses them, even if that abuser is you have paradoxically succeeded in creating a truly strong human being. Look closely at the chairs around your own dining room table tonight. Look at the faces of the people you call your blood. Are they sitting there out of genuine mutual respect? Or are they held hostage by the heavy, unspoken debts of obligation? You might find that the fortress you have spent your life defending was actually a prison all along. The fortress of family is only as strong as the truth it is built upon. When the walls are constructed from lies, the bravest thing you can do is strike the match, burn the fortress to the ground, and learn to finally warm your own hands by the fire.